NACDL is the association of the nation's criminal defense bar.
Welcome to Credits Without Contact. I'm your hostess, Laura Sheely, and I'm super excited today. We've got George Shiro here, and I asked George. He was one of the first people that I asked to be my guest, and so I'm super excited about that. But before we get to my special guest, I've got another special guest that just came yesterday to help me host Credits Without Contacts. It's not Baby Yoda, it's the child. And so the child is here, and I figure, you've got to have a little bit of fun during this pandemic. So I have the child helping me host. I've got a great guest. I think we had a successful earworm with In the Jungle, and got eye candy for your hostess, and we've got a great guest, and I think that's all the boxes that makes this a great episode. So George is he is the lab director at Scales Laboratory, Forensic Laboratory. But George started out in, he's been in Louisiana a while. He was involved in the government side of this, as was I, with the state police and different parishes. But I'm going to bring George in and let him go over some of his background, and wait for it. George Shiro, everybody. Yay!
I thought I was the eye candy this episode, Laura.
Well, you know what? This episode's going to be great because we've got you as eye candy, me as eye candy, and the child.
Oh, nice.
Now everybody calls him Baby Yoda, but he's actually from the new Disney Mandalorian. It's a Star Wars. It's after the Empire is defeated, and it's the new series that Disney put out called The Mandalorian, and he just came out yesterday. And I had ordered him probably 4 months ago, and they just released him yesterday. So
I'm so pleased he'll be joining us today.
Well, thank you.
The Force will be with us.
So with the three of us, I mean, this is a big hit. I'm thinking national.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I'm thinking that Ellen DeGeneres, watch out. So George, tell us about yourself.
Well, my name is George Shiro. I am.
I pronounced that wrong, didn't I?
Yeah, but so does everybody else. I tell everybody.
And I hate that because people pronounce my name wrong as well. It's Shiro.
Yeah, like school.
Okay, I am so sorry, George.
No,
I've been doing that for probably 20 years now.
That's okay. Everybody does it.
I am so sorry. Please say that again, and I won't interrupt.
Okay. My name is George Shiro, and I'm currently the lab director at Scales Biological Laboratory in Brandon, Mississippi. We're a private DNA testing facility, although I have other specialty areas that I also work in, and I do quite a bit of consulting for criminal defense. In addition to, our lab does some work, some analytical work for the defense. About our breakdown is about 90% law enforcement, prosecution, about 10% defense work. And my background is I have a Bachelor of Science degree in microbiology from Louisiana State University. Go Tigers!
I see against the wall is the tiger back there. Yeah.
And I have a Master of Science degree from the University of Central Florida in industrial chemistry and forensic science. I began my career at the Jefferson Parish Sheriff's Office Crime Lab about 35 years ago. I started off in kind of general criminalistics, doing marijuana analysis, arson analysis, gunshot residue detection. After doing that for about a year and a half, I moved into the serology section of the lab, where I was trained by Dr. Joseph Warren in serology. And then from there, about 1988, I left and went to the Louisiana State Police Crime Lab, where I continued working in serology and also began more formally going to crime scenes, investigating crime scenes. I'd done a little bit of it with Jefferson Parish, but I became part of the Louisiana State Police's crime scene investigation team. I continued working there, and around probably 1999 or so, I set up the first DNA lab at the Louisiana State Police Crime Lab. Myself and my former coworker, Carolyn Booker, she and I set it up. We validated the systems, trained the personnel, and then I left there and went to the Acadiana Crime Lab, which is a kind of regional crime lab in Cajun country down in southwest Louisiana, where I was the DNA technical leader. And while I was there, continued working crime scenes as well as remaining a casework analyst. I retired from there right around the end of 2013, and came over here to Bo Scales, Dr. Bo Scales' lab. He was ready to retire and was looking for someone to take it over. So I took it over, and been doing it for about the past 6.5 years, and have just been loving it, being out in the private sector.
That's awesome. That's awesome. You and I and Peter, and it really goes to our age. We were all truly old school. How, and I think all of us still believe that was the right way that it was done. Is that number one? I think we all believe in serology.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think we all believe that the crime scene, it's very helpful to have an analyst at a crime scene.
Absolutely.
And Peter and I talked about that when I had Peter on as a guest, Peter Valentin, and that's changed so much since I was with the Texas Department of Public Safety, and we were in the lab, but any major crime scene, I was also on that.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And I collected, packaged, went through the crime scene, controlled the crime scene for as long as it took. And then took that back to the lab and did the analysis. And I think in 2020, it is so different. I mean, it's so compartmentalized.
Right. And I agree. I think that's one of the double-edged swords of accreditation, is that because accreditation has required everyone to become so specialized and so compartmentalized that they're missing the big picture in a lot of these things. And a lot of the defense consultation that I do, that's one of the things. Everybody has their little part. The pathologist does their part. The crime scene investigator does their part. The lab people do their part. But nobody, in a lot of cases, take this and put it all together. And I think that's what's missing. And like I said, I think it's a direct result of accreditation. And again, accreditation is a good thing, but again, I think that's the double-edged sword of it, is that it's caused us to become so specialized that it's almost a fear of going out and looking at these other aspects of the investigation.
Well, I absolutely think accreditation is a step in the right direction. There's several steps that we need to take. That's just one of many. But I think that there is very much a need for a generalist, which essentially is what we are. The ones of us that have a lot more white and have lost the pigmentation in our hair, right? We're the ones that can do DNA, serology, crime scenes, and view it as a whole and not just as a certain segment. And I think we're missing that. And I think that now you talk to a DNA analyst who's just gotten out of school and been trained, and maybe this is their third or fourth time testifying, and you ask them about serology, and they could give two craps to serology. They don't care about it. They don't
Right.
think it's important. And that truly is not thinking about the whole.
Correct.
Because as soon as these labs started archiving serology, I just shuddered. I was, I guess, shivered. I was very fearful. And I think that we're going to go back to it, but maybe in a different direction with RNA.
Yeah, that's what I would really love to see developed, is some good messenger RNA systems to be able to determine what the cellular origin is of some of this DNA that we're finding.
I would love that. I would absolutely love to see it. I think we're moving very slow, and until we are able to implement and validate it, and really get that done, and see the RNA assays that will be available, I still think that serology plays a critical role in a majority of our cases.
Right.
So now you said something interesting. Scales, where you're the lab director, they do 90% of police investigations?
That's correct. The large majority of our customers are Mississippi law enforcement agencies. We also do all of the identifications for unidentified remains where they can't do fingerprints or dental. They'll send the bones or the teeth to us. We'll do the DNA on that for the state of Mississippi. And we also do it for Nashville, Memphis, and Beaumont, Texas. So,
okay.
And we do a little bit of paternity work as well, a little bit of civil paternity work. And like I said, about 10% of what I do, both in terms of consultation, in terms of casework, is defense work.
Okay. That's kind of the opposite of me. However, I don't have a lab. I'm just a consultant with no benchtop to work at.
Yeah, well, my consulting work, 100% of it is pretty much defense,
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I know that you prepared and brought a presentation with us, or for us today, and I am very excited about that. You're going to talk to us today, not about DNA, but about crime scenes.
Yes, that's correct. One of the things I want to do is kind of go through, how a crime scene is processed, what some of the pieces that should be in place. And, this presentation I get is directly, a portion of it is directly what I give to law enforcement officers in terms of what they should be doing, what they should be looking for, and what type of policies they should have, and that sort of thing. And I think it's important for the defense community to know and realize, what goes on or what should go on in a crime scene investigation, and, how one should be conducted properly, what steps should be taken. Especially in this day and age when we talk about secondary DNA transfer in terms of things that, but my presentation today is strictly going to be about the crime scene, touch on a little bit about DNA. And then I have some case examples of some defense cases that I've worked where information from the crime scene has been critical in helping provide a defense for some individual clients.
Well, that sounds great. I know that Tiffany Roy, and she owns Forensic Aid LLC, and I had her on, and we discussed a DNA transfer quite a bit, and compared it actually to the COVID virus, and how COVID is being transferred. And I
Right.
think that from this point on in our careers, it's going to be so much easier to explain DNA transfer now that everybody has, unfortunately, has had to partake in being around during this pandemic.
Right.
But on the good note, if there is such a thing during a pandemic, explaining DNA transfer just got a lot easier.
Right.
I feel.
Right. I agree.
So yeah, I think crime scenes are critical. I think that oftentimes they're overlooked. And one thing that just really irritates the hell out of me is that the investigator, the detective will get on the stand and say, no, I didn't document it, but this is what we normally do, so I'm just going to go ahead and say I did it. That
Yeah.
doesn't cut it.
Yeah.
If it's not documented, it wasn't
It
done.
didn't happen. Right.
And it's very disingenuous, I think, for them to get on the stand and say something like that.
Right.
And I think so many aspects of the crime scene and the crime scene processing can be very misleading to the finder of fact. And
Yeah.
I think that we really do need to look at what the officers are, how the officers are being trained. And when they get up and they say they have all of this training, well, then why didn't you put it to use?
Right.
Because it's quite apparent when you go through the documentation that if in fact they did have the training, they did not implement that training, at least for that crime scene.
Right. And, we talk today so much about human factors. This has become our new thing, in terms of forensic science, as well as the legal community. Bias starts at the crime scene. I mean, that's ground zero for where, it's going to determine what's collected, what's not collected. And so we have that to deal with as well, because we only get one shot at it.
Yes.
And, if you have certain biases saying, well, this was actually, we think it's this kind of crime when actually it's something else, then there's going to be issues with, especially when it comes, years later, presenting it in court and trying to mount a defense against it.
Well, and at ground zero, if they've gone in and moved a whole bunch of evidence before the photo documentation, there is no way to go back.
Right.
For anybody to be able to go back. And so I like that it is ground zero. And I think that we really need to focus on that. And I'm so excited about your presentation. I may interrupt a few times, but otherwise I'm going to let you take it, and the child and I will sit back and watch the presentation.
Okay, I'll be interested if the child has any questions. That'll be most intriguing.
I'm going to be interested as well.
All right. Thanks, Laura. Here we go.
Thanks, George.
Okay, this is my presentation. Here's my contact information if anybody's interested. And we'll go ahead and just jump right into it. Again, we're talking about crime scene investigation. We want to make sure that that it's done properly. And if it wasn't done properly, are there areas that can be explored by the attorneys to see if they can find any headway for their client? So we'll go ahead. Let's see. Okay. Oh, there we go. Okay. All right, this is the first presentation, first picture. What's wrong with this picture? And this is from a crime scene, and this is typical of, in a lot of cases when you go onto a crime scene, what you might see. A lot of people who have no business there, standing around, milling around in the crime scene, potentially contaminating evidence, altering evidence. And this is a problem that's been with crime scene investigation for over 50 years. I heard one forensic scientist talking about it 30 years ago, and it's the same problem we see today. Too many people coming in the scene wanting to see what's going on when they have no business being there. This includes unnecessary police officers, perhaps non-essential EMS people who happen to be around, and politicians. You may have, if it's a small town murder, you may have the mayor show up to the scene for some reason.
A lot of looky-loos, and I bet there's not a crime scene log going down there.
That's right. I absolutely agree. Nobody's recording who's coming in or out of the crime scene, which is one of the things we absolutely have to have as part of a crime scene investigation. Now, there are certain prerequisites that should be available before we're even talking about going to a crime scene. There should be administrative policies in place, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. All the officers who go to the scene, especially first responders, all police officers should be trained and have the ability to recognize evidence, because sometimes evidence isn't right out there in your face. Sometimes it's subtle. It may be something as small as a fiber or a hair that's critical. It may have to do with digital evidence that's around. So all the officers need to be able to recognize that evidence. And another thing we need to talk about whenever we're dealing with crime scenes are dealing with mistakes. And we all make mistakes. I've made a mistake or two on a crime scene. One time I once photographed an entire autopsy without any film in the camera. So, and I guarantee it didn't happen again, but you know, it was a mistake. I had to deal with it. I had to document it, that it happened.
Well, and mistakes, you know, we try, especially in our field, George, we try very, very hard not to make mistakes.
Right.
But we are human, and if we do make a mistake, the most important thing to do is admit to it, document it. You know, as long as we admit it and document it and be prepared to talk about it, you know, it's okay, right?
Yeah.
It's when we fail to admit it and we fail to document it and we want to not hide it, you know, then that's not okay.
Right.
And I'm not saying mistakes, you know, you don't strive to make mistakes, certainly. And once you do, you don't ever do it again.
Right.
Unless you, I mean, there's been horrible, you've gone to crime scenes, I've gone to crime scenes. There's horrible things that happen at crime scenes. Sometimes things happen that you can't stop from happening. But you also, if you have made a mistake, you'll never make that same one again, in my experience.
Right. And that's one of the things you want to make sure that you're learning from these mistakes if you do make them. If you start repeating them too much, then it might be time to find another profession.
That's right. Then it's problematic.
Yeah.
Or if you're found hiding them, it's problematic.
Right. That's even worse. That's right. So let's talk a little bit about administrative policies. And this is going to vary greatly from administration to administration. It's going to depend probably on if the agency is accredited. But when I was with the Louisiana State Police, we did a lot of crime scene investigation for a lot of rural communities who may have only one or two serious crimes a year. So they may not have policy. But every place that's dealing with them should have some sort of administrative policy. The first part of that policy should be it's recognized as specialized operation. Okay, you can't just throw anybody in there to go work the crime scene just kind of willy-nilly. It's just like a SWAT team operation. There has to be people with specialized knowledge and specialized training that handle crime scenes. The policy should address non-essential personnel. You know, who's going to be essential at the crime scene? Who's going to be the person working the crime scenes? This should all be spelled out. Who's in charge of the crime scene? It also has to apply from the very top of the administration on down, meaning that the sheriff or the chief of police, they have to make it that policy so that it applies to them as well. Because again, if you have a big high profile case, you may want everybody to come see it. If it's somebody who's maybe important in the community, you're going to have people wanting to come in and see. But again, that has to come from the top down and make sure that nobody who needs to be there isn't there. It has to define who's in charge of the crime scene, and there's kind of sort of a hierarchy that kind of goes along with that. Like typically, first person who's going to be in charge is the first person who finds a scene, first responder. When the detectives get there, they may then be in charge of the crime scene. Or if the crime scene investigators come in, they may then be in charge. But it has to define who's in charge, who's going to take responsibility for the crime scene. It's also got to allow for communication, because I found that in most of the cases I've worked, both on the state side as well as the defense side, that 90% of the problems deal with communication. Somebody didn't get the critical piece of evidence or the critical piece of information that they needed in order to put this together, or something gets dropped along the way that somebody who's a first responding officer sees something significant or maybe smells something significant, or there's something associated with the crime that he doesn't communicate to anybody else, so it gets lost in the translation, essentially. Also, there needs to be time to properly work a scene. The policy should allow them ample time to work a crime scene. I mean, and Lori you probably attest to this. Some crime scenes you might be able to knock out in an hour. Some might take days that you're literally out there. So
And I'm going to jump in on this
Sure.
one. This is one of the things that I see to this very day is that when I worked a crime scene, we worked it until we decided we were done.
Right.
And if any of the lawyers out there that are watching this have even been with me on an evidence view, they would just be rolling their eyes right now thinking, oh my God, I'd hate to be with her on a crime scene because I take so long, because that's how I was trained.
Right.
You take the time that you need to make sure that everything is documented to your satisfaction.
That's right.
And in a crime scene, it's far more than just documentation. It's collection. It's a thought process. You're thinking about the blood spatter, the blood stain pattern analysis. You're thinking about so many things that you can't knock one out in an hour.
Right.
And you may take days.
Right.
Or weeks.
Yeah. Depending on what the case is, it very well could.
And you know what? It's okay.
Right.
If you've got the right crime scene personnel there and they know what they're doing, you let them do it for as long as they need to do, and there should never be a rush on it. And I'm seeing, in 2020 with my cases, I'm seeing, so maybe 2018, 2019 homicides that they've released the scene after a couple of, hours or maybe even after a day or so or 2 days, but they release the scene and then they decide, well, maybe I should have collected this. And then they go back and they collect this evidence and now that's essentially worthless. However, they want to give more weight to it.
Right.
And if there was that weight to it, that should have been, the crime scene should have lasted longer. And you should have done it right the first time.
Right.
And I don't see any excuse at all. This is a real pet peeve of mine, if you can't tell, are people rushing crime scenes.
Right.
And just trying to get through them. It's hot. It's yucky. There's bugs. That's horrible. I've been there. And this little fat forensic scientist, sweating with, I remember one where bees were attacking me, but I stayed. And I stayed as long as it took to make sure that I did it correctly.
That's absolutely right.
Now, before we go on, I wanted to, you are calling these administrative policies. I often refer to them as protocols.
Right. Right.
Now, for our lawyers that are trying to discover these policies, which I can assure you, unfortunately, as you know, there are so many agencies that don't have protocols or administrative policies for crime scenes.
Correct. That's absolutely right.
And that's shameful. And again, no excuse. Whether they're accredited by CALEA or whatever, there's no excuse for policies and protocols not to be in place.
Right.
So I just wanted to ask if I am correct in saying that your administrative policies are actually, we can also refer to them as protocols, crime scene protocols.
Right, yeah, and protocols usually evolve or descend from the policies. So, you have the policy in place and then you have the protocols that should go with the policies, spelling out exactly what, needs to be done. Another thing, the policy should address is recruitment of crime scene investigators. Now, years ago, people that got put into crime scene investigation were usually the ones that got in some sort of trouble out on the streets. So they had to put them in kind of a safe place.
The property room.
Right, exactly.
The property room folks.
Right. And, I don't know if that's so much the case today. Now I think they push them, in some kind of desk job or something. But at the time, that's what you had for crime scene investigators were the people who couldn't do anything else throughout the department. So, the policy should address recruiting crime scene investigators. There are a lot of people who want to get into that profession. There are a lot of people who want to do it. There are a lot of curricula out there for crime scene, curriculums, and curricula for crime scene investigation. And so you should recruit people who actively want to do this and, show some enthusiasm and some aptitude for it. Also, the policy should provide for continuing education of the crime scene investigators so that they can get out and learn, how's the best way to use a metal detector, teach me about bloodstain pattern analysis. What's the latest with genetic genealogy and touch DNA and that sort of thing. And also the equipment use should be also kind of regulated by policy in terms of, how much are you going to allow the crime scene investigators to practice with that equipment, use that equipment, become familiar with it? How are they going to, can they, do they know all the ins and outs of the equipment? I find that, a lot of times I'll get crime scene photos to review, and some of them are frankly bad just because the person did not understand the limitations of the equipment they were dealing with, the limitations of the camera. So many people nowadays are using their cell phones to document things, which I think should be, except in extreme cases, it should be a no-no to document evidence on a cell phone. If you're out in the middle of nowhere and that's the only thing you have, and some evidence is getting ready to blow away, then take a picture of it with your phone. But there are too many security issues, I think, and too much leaking of these confidential photos that can get out there through that use. Even though these cameras are very capable of taking very good pictures, but they still have their limitations like everything else. And again, you have security issues with that. But again, the policy should address that. And again, protocols should flow from those policies as to how they're going to use their equipment, how much use will they be able to, how much practice can they get with that equipment.
Well, and we were talking when I had Peter Valentin, we were talking about, nowadays people don't even know how to take a 90-degree photograph of a bloodstain pattern.
Yeah, I have some examples of that in my presentation, actually.
It's horrific. I mean, we spent months on crime scene photography when we were being trained, just
Right.
on crime scene photography,
Yep.
and the black and white with the bald aperture on luminol. I mean, there were reasons for all of that because it wasn't luminol positive if it didn't develop the film.
Right.
And so that's a whole different section. But anyway, I digress.
So the other thing that that prerequisite that should be in place is the ability to recognize evidence. And all police officers should have some training in recognizing evidence, because they never know when they'll be put in the position of being the first responding officer to a scene, and there may be transient evidence that could get lost at the scene. For instance, a police officer goes out to a scene. He finds a body in a ditch. There's a storm getting ready to come along. There may be shoe print evidence that could be getting lost, tire track evidence that could be getting lost, fibers, hairs, anything like that could be potentially getting lost. That officer, again, he may only have a cell phone and some envelopes in his car, but he should use that and try and save that evidence, because at least it'll be preserved somewhat. May not be the most perfect evidence, but there may still be some value added information to that. Hang on one second. Let me cut that phone off.
Well, and I think in this day and age, it's ridiculous not to train our patrol officers not to have some of this recognition of evidence, and that even goes with sexual assaults.
Yeah.
When I left Texas Department of Public Safety and I got to Oklahoma City to start, opening that lab up and making it a DNA lab, I found out that many of the hospitals, it depended on what night, but they didn't want to do SANE exams. And so the patrol officer, it's not their fault, but there was no designated area to get a sexual assault exam done. And so I had one that the patrol officer took the alleged victim in and out of the car 4 different times.
Oh,
And we recognize it, George, but I don't think a lot of people, and it's not, I don't say this in any sort of demeaning way. In fact, just the opposite, is a person is a crime scene in a sexual assault.
absolutely.
And so would anybody ever think about trying to move an entire crime scene 4 different times before it got processed? And that's what they were doing.
Right.
And it was horrible. So, and that's when we established the SART program and the SANE program, and that stopped. But you have to think about everything as a crime scene, including
Right.
individuals.
Yeah, absolutely. And these police officers as well, they can be trained to handle minor crimes like, vandalism type crimes, or, where you may have like a non-violent type crime involved. They could be trained to collect evidence. It's very simple. They could be trained to document some evidence. They can be trained to collect fingerprints, that sort of thing. So all officers should have this training and should be cognizant of evidence and its limitations, as well as the potential for it to get destroyed or contaminated at a scene. So that will save things in terms of keeping the value of that evidence.
And handling minor crime scenes will put the officers in a thought process to handle major scenes.
Absolutely.
They can start
Absolutely.
thinking about, okay, if this was a graffiti type situation and there's a can of spray paint, what on that can could I get DNA results from?
Right.
And you swab the sprayer button from the spray can, and you can swab the area around the can, because the sensitivity of DNA analysis is at its greatest right now.
That's right. That's right.
And so, but to get even a person thinking about DNA and DNA transfer, that's a start. And once you start thinking about it, and you're able to be able to recognize that, you don't stop, and you're just better when it comes to a major crime scene, because then you start looking at evidence completely differently.
Right. Yeah, and sometimes evidence itself is not, when you go to scene, it may be subtle. This was a case I worked. It was a house fire. Originally, it was treated as an accident. They went in. They found a female victim in the residence. They put the fire out. They brought her to the morgue to be autopsied. They released the house to the family. Well, when they did the autopsy, they discovered that her throat had been cut. So this changed from an accidental house fire to now a homicide. And so, like I said, when you're going through, sometimes, trying to figure out what is evidence, what's not evidence, can be subtle. I was at the scene, and one of the things I like to try and do is try and determine, what are potential points of entry and exit that, a person may have had during this, if they've come in anywhere. And so we ended up having to bring back all the firefighters back to the scene and ask them about, what windows did they breach? Did they find any doors locked, open, that sort of thing. And as I'm going around the house, I'm looking at different things, and this was the back of the house. It was kind of a porch area. And so I'm kind of thinking, well, where would be a good point of entry? We obviously have the doors. And then something caught my eye, and I was like, every day you don't see a stepladder and a planter like that.
Yep.
And that little window right above it, you could see the smoke trail coming out of it. So it meant the window had to be open at some point when the fire was going on. And at first I thought this was maybe a vent point that the firefighters had opened, but none of them said they had opened it at all. And so I looked at that as a potential point of entrance. And then when we looked at this evidence, we found shoe prints on the ladder, on the step ladder. And then we found a thumbprint that had actually been etched into the glass from the fire. And eventually that was linked to the perpetrator of the crime. But again, sometimes these things aren't subtle. And that's why, again, Laura, when we talked about this policy of making sure you have enough time, time is a friend of the, the crime scene investigator, because the longer you can stand out there and look at things and kind of piece them together, the more things kind of fit together, and you can kind of see where where that's going to take you, what evidence you can look at and key on, and that sort of thing, and where you maybe put your
and
resources.
we do that now in the defense cases that you get, in the cases that I get, when I have crime scene photos. It's not just going through those photos once.
Mm-hmm.
It's going through them multiple times, because every time you go through them, you might be able to see something that you didn't before.
That's right.
And it's not because we want to waste the time or money of the agency or the client. It's because we have got to, it takes a lot of time to be able to spot a ladder in a flower
Mm-hmm.
pot.
All right.
From either when you're there or from looking at crime scene photos.
Yeah, and that's that's one of the things I say. As private consultants, we do have an advantage in that we have typically more time available to sit out, put things out, kind of absorb them. Maybe set them aside for a little while, come back, look at them again, get a fresh perspective maybe. And I think that's one of the big advantages of us being able to take all that information we get from autopsy reports, lab reports, crime scene photos, and being able to coalesce all that information together and to come out with, to see where we can provide the best information for the defense.
But I'm not gonna, I completely agree with you, but I'm not gonna let the police off the hook on one like this.
Yeah.
Because we both know that usually an autopsy is gotten to within a day or two.
Right.
They're not usually waiting 30 days to do an autopsy. So usually it comes in, my experience, they come in, if they fridge them, it's not for more than 24 hours, usually 12 hours.
Right.
They get them out, they do the autopsy. So what is the reason to release a scene prior to an autopsy being done?
Right. There's no reason, absolutely no reason that this scene should have been released. And once you've released it to the family, how much more difficult does that get, taking it back, taking the control? And now that people have all been throughout the scene, potentially providing contamination to the scene. All right, let's move on to our next topic of dealing with mistakes. Okay, we've had a brief discussion on this, and this kind of goes along the lines of what we're saying. Everybody makes them. Hopefully you don't repeat the mistake. And if you do, potentially, maybe you shouldn't be doing this type of work if you're repeating the same mistakes. And that they need to be admitted up front and documented. That's an absolute must. And I think that is probably the hardest thing when dealing with people's egos, is getting them to admit they made a mistake. And it can quickly and easily go from, a simple mistake and to a cover-up. And then to a conspiracy. And the way I kind of, couch that to police officers when I talk to them, I said, let's say you go into a crime scene and there's a body lying there and there's a gun right next to the hand of the victim or whatever, or in the hand, a gun in the hand. And as a police officer, maybe your training tells you, take that pistol and move it away from that person's hand. Okay. That may or may not be a mistake, depending on your policy and depending on your perspective, depending on, whatever it is. But then when your crime scene investigator comes in and he asks you, where'd you find that pistol? And you pick that pistol up and put it back into that person's hand, then does that become a cover-up? It's like, okay, well, that's not it went from a mistake to cover-up. And now you have more than one person in on it. Then does it become a conspiracy? Okay, so again, these things can quickly escalate and give the perception of, a cover-up and a conspiracy when it may not necessarily be that.
Well, and when you're giving, when we were trained, I'm gonna say we, because you've lost a lot of pigment as well. So when we were trained, you photo document everything like it is before you let anybody into it.
Right.
So you can go back to the photographs. But we were also, it, you don't want, you don't, I don't ever want to just automatically jump to a conspiracy.
Right.
But sometimes I don't think they give us a choice.
Yeah. I mean, it is, especially when you have people that know better and have been trained better, and, they've gotten into some kind of groupthink mentality, then that they may push us into that corner. You're right. So again, and one of the things, you want people to do is to learn from each crime scene. And, whenever I would finish a crime scene and I'd be driving back, because when I was working in Louisiana, kind of like you with Texas DPS, we go all over the place in Louisiana. And, on the drive back, I would kind of sort of debrief myself as I'm driving back from the crime scene. It's like, what could I have done that was better? How can I improve the next crime scene kind of thing? Was there something more that I could do in terms of, learning from each of these crime scenes? And each crime scene as a learning experience builds on each other so that, hopefully you get to the point where, you can do a great crime scene investigation. And that's what, the goal should always be.
Well,
and like I said, go
you're
ahead.
thinking about that on the drive home. You're thinking about that in your shower.
Mm-hmm.
And you're thinking about that as you're laying awake, thinking about the crime scene.
Right.
Even if you're dead tired, even if
Yeah.
you've been up for 36 hours on that crime scene, that's where your mind is.
Right.
Is what should I have done differently? Could I have done anything differently?
Right.
Should I have collected that, or did I collect too much?
Right.
Which I don't think is a possibility.
No.
Property room people may, but I don't. But anyways, absolutely.
So here was a case. This is another case that I worked. Was initially investigated. A police officer went onto the scene. The story was this lady. She worked as a nurse. She came home, according to her husband. She came home. She went to bed. He hears a gunshot. He comes out and he finds that she's supposedly has killed herself. So he calls the police. They come home. They come over. They find her in this position, and the first initial officer was getting ready to write it off as a suicide. Said, hey, looks like a suicide to me. That's all I'm going to do with it. But fortunately, another more experienced, seasoned investigator was there and said, hey, let's take our time with this.
Thank God.
Let's look at this. Let's process it like a regular scene. And so what they did was they had taken this shotgun, and this shotgun they ended up submitting to the lab for our analysis. And these were different parts of the shotgun. It was I think it was a 16 gauge or shotgun that was purchased by the couple's son for a Christmas present. It had been in a layaway, never been fired before. And so when it was submitted to the lab, first thing that we did was we fumed it with cyanoacrylate or super glue to see if we could develop any prints on the gun. Didn't get any prints, but we had a few smudged areas that we found of interest. So we swabbed those up, and these were the different areas that we swabbed. We swabbed the hammer, we swabbed the shotgun forearm, the shotgun buttstock grip, the trigger, and the release button. And the thing about this type of shotgun is there's only one way to fire it. It's a single shot shotgun. The only way to fire it is to cock that hammer back. So we tested all these areas for DNA. We got no DNA from the release button and the trigger. Now, shotgun forearm, we got a female profile, full female profile. And so we say, oh, maybe, could be a, suicide. On the buttstock grip, however, we saw a major contributor female with a minor male contributor. So we started to say, well, this is kind of interesting now. Let's see what we got from there. Then we looked at the shotgun hammer. The only thing we had on a shotgun hammer was a pure male profile. No mixture, no female profile, which female profile, again, it was a ridged hammer. It takes a lot of pressure to cock it. It had
a lot of cells.
Yeah, a lot of cells. Had a female, cocked it, we'd expect to see her profile. So what we ended up doing was we ended up getting a cigarette butt from the husband at some point, and then when we compared the DNA profile, it matched him on the hammer, which is pretty incriminating evidence in the case. But again, this was a case that, you know, initially could have been written off as a suicide. You know, nobody would have known any better. It would have never come to the lab. You know, would have never been able to explore the evidence and work with the evidence. So again, you know, mistakes still do happen, and you know, and luckily in this case, we're able to still get some valuable evidence.
Going back to the original picture on that, George, you wouldn't necessarily expect on a suicide for the gun to be in that position if that was the first photo that was actually taken.
Right. Yeah, that was the other thing, was that the position of the gun was questionable as well.
And that's a long reach.
Yeah.
From where the barrel is to the trigger.
Yeah, and it was right up under her chin was where the shot was.
So, I mean, there's a lot of things to look at the scene as well as at the lab.
Right, right. And again, you know, it just goes to show that, you know, an inexperienced person at a scene can make a mistake. And,
Yep.
you know, again, and this is things that, again, these policies have to address, these protocols have to address. And, you know, the age-old thing, you know, treat it like a homicide until you prove otherwise kind of thing is the adage.
Training and education.
Right.
Key. Protocols, training, and education.
Yep. All right. Now, talk about some of the priorities. And this kind of gets into the mindset and of, you know, what happens at a crime scene, something that a lot of people who haven't done crime scenes may be disconnected from. And I ask this question all the time to law enforcement people, and they almost always get the answer wrong. I say, what's your first priority at a crime scene? And their first priority, say, is protect the evidence. I said, no, it's not to protect the evidence. The first priority is personal safety. I said, anytime that there's a crime scene, you know, you're responding, you have to make sure that you're safe, you're in a safe place to be able to handle that you're following safety protocols so that your, you know, personal safety is paramount. And as a result of that, we understand that some evidence is going to get compromised in that process. You know, if they're going through, they're having to search, make sure that the scene is safe. They may have to, you know, it may be, you know, if there's a gas leak or something, you know, gas has to be turned off, whatever it may be. But personal safety is the number one priority.
I'm going to interrupt you.
Sure.
I always trained my officers, the number one priority is making sure that the lab analyst that is out there is safe.
Yeah, that's what I always used to joke. I said, because I was a civilian like you on a crime scene. I said, I want to make sure there's somebody with a gun and a radio with me at all times when I'm at the crime scene.
Yep. So my number one priority was making sure the little fat forensic scientist was always safe. And then their personal safety, and then securing the evidence.
Right.
Right.
And, you know, Lori, we say that and all joking, but there have been crime scene investigators who've been left alone at scenes and have been attacked.
I haven't been attacked, but I've had my share of death threats from various people. But I've had officers take their gun belt off to help me lift something, and public is still entering the scene.
Yeah.
You know, there have been very, very scary situations that we go into, and it is, you know, you say it jokingly, but it is scary, and nobody should be attacked on a crime scene. I mean, we're trying to get at the truth.
Right. And, you know, and especially when you have a shooting out on the street where it's less controlled environment, you're right. There are a lot of factors there that can go into, you know, someone getting harmed, especially if tensions are high in the surrounding area. It can be. And I've actually been on a scene where I've had the suspect helping me back up my car, directing me to back up my car, you know?
Yeah.
And so, like I said, we know that, you know, they can be tricky. You know, you don't know what type of mindset people are in, But again, this personal safety and of course the personal safety of the civilian lab employees are paramount in this. So, but that's the first order. And the point is, again, that evidence may get altered as part of that. Then the next thing they may have to do is render aid to the injured, because again, life takes priority over things. You're going to have EMS coming in. You may have firefighters coming in. They have to do everything they can to stabilize that person, get them out of there. And again, you're going to have alterations to the scene that can't be helped. And, my recommendation and part of the policy and procedure should be that if you have an officer there and there are other people performing life-saving measures, to document what they're doing so that you'll have a record of what they did, how they did it, if anything got potentially altered in the process.
And I think the body cams of the first responders are helping with that.
Yeah.
But what I do want to, maybe I'm wrong in how I teach, and I completely agree with you. I think the officer safety, absolutely. And I think that if somebody needs attention, that is always a second requirement. However, I can't tell you how many times the body has already started to decomp, and yet first responders go in and attach the tags, right?
Right.
And there is no reason whatsoever to do that. And it is just ripe for DNA transfer.
Right. Yeah. And and a lot of that is going to be, and one of the things that the defense community might have to be aware of is that is sometimes out of the control of police in terms of, what the EMS people have to do and what their protocols. And, as part of the communication process, I believe that, crime scene information should be provided to the EMS people just to let them know, hey, you really don't need to do this. But again, they have their own protocols. They have their own bosses. It's a little bit more difficult to dictate to them, what they can and cannot do,
But if they don't have policy on it, then the person, and it's going to be the first responder,
right,
needs to be trained that if clearly
Yes.
there's a dead victim, let's do nothing to continue to compromise that victim. And if there are not any policies from EMS or the medical first responders, and they're taking their cues from the police officers, then don't let them attach the EKG tags.
Right.
Don't let them mess with the body.
Right. I agree. The next thing that, police officers have to do is protect the public. So again, there may be, a suspect at the scene, he may be belligerent, may fight the police. And again, you're going to have more evidence that's altered along the way. But again, that's part of the course of their duties that they have to do in order to do their jobs effectively. Then the last thing is to protect the evidence. Once the scene has been stabilized, once everybody's been, the injured have been taken care of, the suspect, any witnesses are out of the scene. At that point, that scene should be shut down, locked down, tape goes up, and no one be allowed in that scene except for the essential personnel at that point.
And essential personnel is not everybody on the department that hasn't been to a homicide before.
Right, exactly.
Essential personnel is not 50 officers, different people on a crime scene log.
Right, exactly. It should just be the people that need to work the scene or there to work the scene and conduct the investigation. That's it. So again, in terms of, protecting the evidence, again, any transient evidence, and we discussed this a little earlier, should be documented and preserved as best as can be done. Again, if you're a first responding officer, there should be one person in charge of the scene. Everything should go in and out of that person as far as who's doing what. And I know, Laura, when I was working at the Louisiana State Police Lab and the Acadiana Lab, when I went there, I was the person in charge because I had the most knowledge.
I was too.
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah, we had the most knowledge. And we would kind of dictate. Now, not all departments work that way, though. Some departments, Some departments, their crime scene investigators only work at the behest of their detectives. You know, the detectives essentially just dictate to them what to do. Sometimes there's not an independent thought process there. But sometimes the crime scene investigators do get to make independent choices. And that's probably the best way. But again, there has to be one person in charge who's calling the shots, but it has to be sort of a collaborative effort as well in terms of getting input from different individuals about what might not be important. Again, the scene needs to be secured. We talked about having a crime scene log. We want to know who's been in and out of that crime scene, once the scene is secured. And again, we talked about removing non-essential personnel. This is getting less and less. This one, do not use the landline in the residence because fewer and fewer people probably have landlines. But again, you don't want to use that because, again, there's call information that you may be able to use that may be evidence involved.
Well, and I think that can even move to not just the landline in the residence, but don't start picking up cell phones.
Right.
And start going through cell phones.
Exactly.
Or computers.
Right. Leave that to specially trained personnel. Collect it, give it to them, let them handle it.
And do nothing with it. Don't turn it. If it's off, don't turn it on. If it's on, just leave it exactly how it is.
Right.
And if they don't do that, that's problematic when it does come time for analysis, and for the defense lawyers, they should know that none of that should be done at a crime scene.
Right. That's correct. And also, you want to set up a command post, and you want to set up the command post away from where the crime scene is. And a command post doesn't have to be anything fancy. It can just be a place where people can meet, discuss the case, maybe take a break, have some drinks, whatever, but it needs to be outside of the crime scene. No smoking in the crime scene. And in this day and age, we still have to tell people, don't smoke, don't eat, don't drink in a crime scene. So there should be a separate place, a command post sort of set aside for that. Here's another example. This was a case I worked back when I was in Louisiana, and it had, essentially it was four crime scenes, four separate crime scenes that we were working. This was one of those days when it was, hot July day in Louisiana where it was, close to 100 degrees. And, but no, this crime scene, we actually were there for the better part of the day, as well as into the next day. We had to go back and do a few things. But what happened was, this was, the story was that it was a drug deal that had gone bad. It kind of took place in the area that you can see back where those vehicles are off those roads. It ended in a chase. The driver of that vehicle was killed with some gunshots. The other person jumped out the car, ran to the ditch, which is over to the left of the photograph if you're facing it, then ran back across to this parking lot, and you can see the tire tracks. The truck that was chasing them came back and hit him, killing him at the scene. And so you can see we have tape set up kind of securing this part of the scene. We had the other scenes that were secured as well. And we also had kind of perimeters set up where we had a perimeter with just the people who were working the scene. Then we had sort of an outer perimeter where people could, where the sheriff's office people could be outside the scene but be close. And then we had one for the reporters and kind of the general public. And just, this is, we talk about some of the types of evidence that, we might not recognize, and some things that could, give value added to the case. If we look at these tire tracks that are there, and you can see the curvature of the tire tracks, the Michigan State Police actually has a database that if we take certain measurements of those wheel bases and those turn radii, that you can sometimes narrow down the type of vehicle it was. And we were able to take the measurements and provide them with the information, and got a lead on the type of truck we were looking for. And then eventually that truck was found and connected to the scene through some other evidence, through some DNA evidence and whatnot. But again, that's something, just looking at the scene, you may not think of in terms, thinking of just beyond tire tracks. But again, we could get some investigative information from this as well.
I think this is, can you go back to that,
sure.
photo? I think this photo is an excellent photo depicting what I'm finding in the last 5 years or so, is that people that are putting up the crime scene tape and deciding the area, they are going too small. And you
Right.
can always go big and
Come in. Yeah.
increase it, right?
Correct. Yes.
And I think this is a really nice, if you really look at this photo, you see the crime scene tape that includes the car and the body and the tire tracks. But then
Right.
you go beyond it, like you were saying, and you can actually see over by the Coke machine to
Yeah.
the right, you've got another taped off
Right.
section. And then you go beyond that. And so this is a really nice demonstration of multiple areas that have been cordoned off, but it is so important to cordon off a large area, and then you always can make it smaller, because until you've been there for a while, even if it looks like a simple shooting, you don't know what you have.
Absolutely right.
And so you want to go large, and then make it smaller as you decide as you're getting a feel for what's happening.
Right.
And what I'm seeing more and more is that they're trying to go as small as possible, and then we've even gone back afterwards, after they've released the scene, and I've been called to go back, and because of what I'm talking about, we found bullets, or casings. We have
Right.
found casings that were never collected, that were in fact part of the scene, but they had cars and everything up there. They never backed off. They never enlarged the crime scene. They wanted the crime scene to just be such a small part. So we had to end up I didn't touch them. I photo documented them. And then instead of me collecting them, I called the police in to collect them. And I gave them the crime scene bags and everything, and taught them how to package the evidence. But I think that's very important for people to realize that if the crime scene looks too small, it probably is.
Right.
Or
right.
was, rather.
Yeah. Yeah, and you can see, here's some more of the tape. You can kind of see, and we had kind of an area where the press could hang out, well beyond the two tape barriers that we already had. And this shows the other side, the other tape on the other side of it was actually a church parking lot, and and you can see the bullet holes in the back. Actually, that's buckshot holes in the back of the trunk of the vehicle. And this vehicle was also lit on fire. And that's where the driver's body was found. So let's talk about, what are steps to a successful crime scene investigation? We've got the scene stabilized. What are we going to do? And it's not any great rocket science or anything like that. The steps are: you gather information when you get there before you even step foot in the scene. Conduct some sort of a walkthrough, or, kind of a go through, kind of gather your thoughts, kind of get a game plan together. Then you document the scene. Then you collect and preserve the evidence. It's really that simple. And it's just a matter of making sure that all these are carried out to the extent that they need to be carried out. So, in the gathering information stage, we, when we get there, we want to speak to the person who's in charge of the scene. We want to speak to anyone who's been in the scene. That may be first responding officers that have been there. And a lot of times these first responding officers, after they've done their initial thing, they leave. They're going back to doing their road duty. We may want to get them back to talk to these people to see what they saw. Did they see anything that was of interest, that anything that they noted that, might be, evidence-wise, or might impact the investigation. Again, it might be EMTs, it might be firefighters, and first responding officers. And we
you
also
might
want
have to get shoe print exemplars, or
Right.
or DNA elimination standards.
Exactly. Yes, that's
So you
the other
definitely
reason.
want to know who was there, and that's so important.
Right. We're also going to want to coordinate with other agencies. The DA's office may be out there, and I'm not a big fan of having them out there and not particularly not in the scene. You don't have a problem if they're at the scene. Of course, you got to coordinate with the medical examiner or the coroner and any other law enforcement agencies who may be involved. We may have something involving ATF, FBI, and the local authorities all at once. And we may also, at some point, may want to speak to people who may be familiar with the scene, such as family members, friends, just to see if anything is different or out of place. And again, we wouldn't bring them into the actively working crime scene, but if they have been in there first, if they discover the body or whatever, we may want to get information from them as well to see how that may fit into the case.
In the aspect of gathering information, oftentimes briefings are done prior to going in a scene and starting to process a scene. There's often a briefing that is done when the detectives finally arrive, when the crime scene personnel finally arrive, if it's different than the detectives. And so there's a briefing, and during the briefing, those people generally take notes. And they're using that briefing information to make some determinations on their thought process at that point and what to collect. And I oftentimes see that those notes are not part of the discovery, and they should be.
Right. And that might be something that specifically needs to be requested or subpoenaed.
Have you been seeing briefing notes? Because I sure have had to request them, and then by the time I get the case and I ask to request them, they say that, well, they've been turned into a report, and sometimes there's a report and there's not, but they're shredded most of the time.
Yeah, I've seen it's varied from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. I've seen some where I've seen the actual handwritten notes, and then others where I haven't. It just varies according to the agency.
I think that's one thing that our audience, if they're in a case right away, they could ask for that information right away prior to it being destroyed.
Right, at the very least, get a preserve order to hold, to make sure that everything is retained.
Yes, that all handwritten notes, even if it's going to go into a report, because we all know that the report, you can watch a video and the report is completely different than what the video has in it.
Right.
And it's the same with the briefing notes. So I just wanted to throw that out there, that's a good idea to be getting the handwritten briefing notes as soon as possible before they get shredded and you're told that they're not there.
Right, absolutely. After we've gathered our information, we want to conduct a walkthrough. We want to do a slow and methodical approach. We want to go in, take our time. We want to keep our hands occupied. And, I've been on at least several cases where people have sworn up and down they haven't touched anything. And, we'll end up finding their fingerprints on something or their DNA on something that they swear they weren't anywhere near. One time I was on a case where the coroner had come in and we'd kind of cleared a path to the body so he could do his job. And I said, okay, doc, I said, you come in, don't touch anything. Very first thing he did was put his hands on both sides of the door frame. And so I was like, no.
People just don't think about it.
Right. They don't think it's kind of unconscious. So that's why I always recommend to often keep your hands occupied. I'd say put a flashlight in one hand and put evidence markers in the other hand when you're conducting your walkthrough. That way you can use oblique lighting on the scene, which oblique lighting is also known as side lighting, where small things cast large objects and makes them more visible than might be seen in overhead lighting. So you can use that, and then you can use the markers to mark your evidence. That way your hands are occupied. Or
carry a box of gloves.
Yeah. Exactly. Anything to keep your hands occupied. And so as we're going through, we want to kind of mark the evidence as we go along, kind of, again, if we see anything obvious, particularly footwear impressions, that's probably the most evidence that gets compromised in a case is footwear evidence, because people, A, they're not cognizant of it, and B, that, like I said, a lot of the times when these initial officers have to go in, they, you know, they're doing their duties, whatever they may have to do, and they may, you know, provide, you know, add additional footwear evidence that wasn't part of the original crime scene.
And that's where oblique lighting comes in too.
Right.
Is to, especially on, I've got a case right now, black tile, and blood all over the place. No camera shots, no indication, no documentation that oblique lighting was utilized, and it would have been so helpful had it been.
Right. Yeah, because like I said, it you know, I found shoe prints that you couldn't even see in, you know, in regular lighting, but you put it on, you know, oblique lighting and they pop.
Yep.
Real nicely.
And sometimes you're down on your hands and knees, and you've got the flashlight at the very side angle that it can be, and boom, they're there.
Yep.
And it's just, I don't know if people aren't being trained to do it, if they, I don't know why it's not being done, but instead of, I mean, you shouldn't get excited as us when you get an oblique lighting shot.
Yeah.
You know,
yeah.
and you're like, oh, yay. I mean, that's something that we should be getting all the time, and we're just not getting it.
Right. And I agree. And, you know, and like I said, you know, every law enforcement agency I have ever lectured to, I've said about using oblique lighting, but I'd be happy if, I mean, probably maybe 1% have used it or utilized it, you know, as part of their investigation. So, you know, and you want to kind of follow the evidence trail, see kind of where it leads you, but you also don't want to have tunnel vision when you're conducting your walkthrough. You want to look in the out of the way places. Things may be secreted someplace. There may be, you know, some other evidence off, you know, that's not associated with the initial scene where someone may have cleaned up or hid some evidence or whatever it may be. So you got to follow the evidence trail, but you also want to make sure you're not getting tunnel vision when you're examining the scene. And again, that goes back to that, what we talked about, bias at the crime scene. You know, if you're starting to lean a certain way, you know, you want to make sure you try and keep your mind as open as possible to all the possibilities and the likely scenarios.
And start trying to fight that to make it something else. So, you know, prove your theory wrong. And if you can't, you know, then work with that. But you've always got to be questioning your hypothesis.
Absolutely.
I mean, we've got to take a scientific approach to it. And if we do that, then, you know, we're not going to, there's always a chance for cognitive bias. We're learning more and more about that. But we can do everything that we can to prevent it. And one of the ways is to fight with yourself on what else could have caused this.
Right. Beat up your hypothesis and see if it, you know,
exactly.
see how strong it is. And so next thing we do after we've conducted the walkthrough, we gather information, we conduct the walkthrough. Next thing we're going to do is want to document the evidence. And we have a number of ways of documenting. We can use video, photographs are a must, sketches, good notes, and chain of custody. Now, I'm seeing, I don't know about you, Laura, but I am seeing, it seems like back in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, I know we were videotaping every scene we went on, but nowadays I haven't seen a crime scene video and I don't know how long. And I don't know what your experience has been.
I got one from Colorado, and it was a 2017 case. It was videotaped, and I was impressed. We always videotaped back in Texas. They didn't when I was with Oklahoma City, but I mean, we did it on mute, of course. But we did videotape. One thing that I'm seeing instead of videotaping are the body cams.
Oh,
but
yeah.
The body cams are not, that's not doing the same thing as a videotape of a crime scene does.
Right. They have a lot of limitations with body cam video that I've seen in recent years. And, you know, but then kind of, I guess the flip side too is now there's so many video cameras around, which I'm starting to see more video of the actual crime itself. So, you know, but that's different. That's a whole different thing.
That makes our job a little bit more easy.
Yeah.
Easier.
Yeah. Sometimes. Yeah.
More easy. I can't speak English today.
Might have to ask the child about that.
Yes. But, you know, and I am still, every crime scene practically that I get is, and you're going to talk about this, is under photographed.
That's correct.
And it costs us nothing. You know,
Right.
the little SD cards they're a little bit expensive, but not like the money that you and I used to spend
On film.
we on film.
Right.
You know, I would go through rolls and rolls and rolls of film
Mhm.
at a scene, and then you had to get it developed, and then you had to develop several copies of it. And so that was quite costly in our budget each year. But now there's no excuse for it.
Right. And I think our camera skills were a little better back then too, because we didn't get the immediate feedback of digital. We had to take pictures, we had to bracket the photographs, which means do multiple exposures sometimes, and make sure that it's all in focus, make sure all your settings are correct.
And
Whereas-
hope.
And hope.
A lot of hope and prayer.
Hope you had filming the camera and hope that your film wasn't bad or anything. And then you get it back and you're like, "Whew, okay, those did come out pretty good."
And you're actually relieved. But now it's instantaneous.
Yeah. So you should know if you have to take another photograph, if you have to do another exposure, if it's out of focus, if take another picture. And I don't think a lot of people are doing that. I think they take it. Some people kind of rush through these scenes when they should be taking their time and documenting everything as thoroughly as possible.
One thing that I'm going to add, and I may be jumping on your presentation, and I apologize, but I want to add to all of the people watching this: do not just settle for a copy of the photographs.
Mm-hmm.
Ask for the metadata.
Right.
Because the metadata, it has helped me in several cases get an idea of, sometimes you have 3, 4, 5 cameras going.
Mm-hmm.
The metadata tells me what camera is taking this photo. It tells me what time. And, there is no excuse for these cameras not to be set on the correct time and date.
Right.
And that's part of the protocol. That's part of the process. And if they can't follow that, what else can they not follow?
Right. Yeah. And I agree. Whenever I get photographs or images now, I always request the original or primary images, and because that always has the metadata with it, and I can see, like you said, when the pictures were taken, if there was some kind of discrepancy in the photographic process, if there was something, why was there a different gap between taking this picture and that picture, and also in terms of when evidence is looked at, is there potential? You can actually create a timeline of when that particular piece of evidence was handled, to see if there is any potential secondary DNA transfer, indirect DNA transfer from one item to another. I mean, if you have a very bloody garment there that has, potentially has a lot of the victim's DNA, and then, next thing you're doing, you're handling something that may have come from the perpetrator, is there going to be transfer from that original item to the next? And the photographs with that metadata can provide us with some insight into that.
And I think that's crucial. And I think oftentimes we are in the discovery, we're presented a disc and of JPEGs, and they're copies, and they're not, they don't have the metadata. What they have is the date that the DA stuck them into their computer,
right,
and copied a disc over and handed them to you. And, there's been fights before about, why do you need the metadata? I'm not going to give you the metadata. Why not?
Yeah.
What's wrong with transparency? Yeah. And so the metadata, it certainly, honestly, from my experience and the metadata is worth, if you have to fight to get it, which you shouldn't, but if you have to fight to get that discovery, it can be worth a lot to your analyst, whoever your analyst is. It can be very, very helpful coming up with discrepancies or verification, right?
Right.
It's not all about discrepancies. It can also be verifying what happened.
Right. And that can help craft a defense, for a person, for the attorney.
But
depending
it's
on what
all
that is.
evidence, and it's all evidence that your expert absolutely needs.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. All right, let's talk a little bit about each one of these. Video, want to know the equipment. And again, I think this is one of the limitations I see with people who do take videos, especially, if you're going from, especially like an arson scene where everything's almost black. If you don't know how to adjust those settings manually, you may not capture the information you want to capture. So it's critical that the person videotaping knows that equipment, knows its limitations, knows how to use the manual compensations and that sort of thing. Now, the advantages of video, an example I always put out to the law enforcement people is I ask them how many people have been to the Grand Canyon. I say, you get to the Grand Canyon, you say, wow, look how impressive, it's so beautiful. And then you take photographs of it and you get back and your photographs don't look nearly as impressive as what you remember. And the reason for that is because our eyesight, we can see in about probably about 160 degrees vision. When we take a photograph, it narrows it down to something about this big. So that's why we're only catching a piece of it. And although video does the same thing, video can mimic eye movement. So it allows us to kind of pan and scan things so that we can see and kind of get better perspective on how things are laid out, how moving through a structure might be. Also, in terms of, I've worked many police shootings in my career when I was with the state, showing what lighting conditions could look like. You can mimic that with the video camera to show people what it was like at that time, what could and could not see, and that sort of thing. So like I said, they have to know the equipment. And again, that's kind of the advantage of video brings to the crime scene investigation. Oh, does the child have a question?
Well, the child just wants to point out that it's also really important that the juror, it brings a perspective in the courtroom,
right,
that the juror can't get, because the juror, they can't go to the house or
right,
to the scene, very seldom.
right,
And so it gives the perspective, it gives an actual better perspective to the jury
right.
or the judge, whoever the finder of fact is.
Right. Yeah. And that's one of the advantages, again, because you can move it around and, again, mimic eye movement and kind of show how a structure is laid out. And I find that, sometimes looking at photographs, I don't get that. But when I see the video, I can clearly see, okay, yeah, well, this is how, this piece moved into this part and that sort of thing. Whenever they're videotaping, I tell them clear the area of people, first of all, and notify everybody that you're taping. And you talked about videotaping on, mute. That's the next thing, sound versus no sound. I always like to use sound because I can record notes kind of as I'm going through. But the disadvantage to that is you're going to pick up everything, every comment, everything that's said. So again, that's what I kind of leave that up to the agency. Say, it's your choice. I prefer sound because, it's out there. You're not hiding anything. But more than likely, unless you've been diligent about clearing everybody out, let them know you're taping. And, so you got to keep your mouth shut for the next 15 minutes or so, or however long it takes them to tape it. Then, the sound versus no sound debate, will probably continue.
Well, and the officers and the crime scene personnel, everybody that's out there, it's we don't go to what we're going to process isn't usually a picnic or a carnival.
No.
It's a horrific event with that could be. It's usually not an event that we want. Personally, that we would want anybody that we know to have to experience.
Right.
We don't want other people to experience what we have.
Right.
But that's just simply they're horrific events and we're out there and we're processing it. The officers and the crime scene personnel sometimes use humor.
Right.
To distract from the emotions that they're feeling.
Absolutely.
And it is not appropriate.
Right.
And it would I think that's why the policy when I was doing it is I was not really a cut up at, I'm a cut up now, but
Right, but
I
not
wasn't a cut up at the scene, but I
right,
did see police officers and I understood why,
right,
is because that's how they were processing this horrific scene that they had to be on.
right,
And they're not at the best moment right there, and that's how they're processing it.
right.
And not everybody has to see how they're processing it mentally
Yeah,
or
and
hear how they're processing it mentally, as long as they're conducting themselves to preserve the evidence
right.
and get that out.
And that's something else too to take into consideration when the defense is, trying to get a hold of the videotapes, because sometimes I think we would initially record with sound, but then when we transfer to like a master tape, we wouldn't put the sound, but we still had the original with the sound. So that'd be something else that the defense investigator may want to look into to see if there's maybe possibly two copies of the tape out there. Again, looking at the original versus maybe what might be a copy of the tape.
And the metadata would show that sound had been removed, that
Right.
aspect of the track had been removed, and so that's again reason to get that underlying data that is embedded with video and photographs these days.
Right. One of the things I tell the officers, use slow movement. And again, you have to know the manual compensations on your camera, how to use them to get the maximum amount of information documented. Because if you move too fast with a video camera, it's gonna be like on a roller coaster. You're not going to be able to catch what you need to see. So I always emphasize use slow movement. There's also some other uses of videos at crime scenes. Infrared, dark clothing sometimes may have blood stains that aren't readily visible, or blood stain patterns like shoe prints that or some sort of pattern evidence on it. And infrared can actually bring that out by blood absorbs infrared, whereas a lot of black material and black dyes reflect infrared, so it'll make those things pop out. And again, that may be something again that, as part of a defense investigation, they may want to get that original evidence and look at it under infrared to see if there are any patterns that may have been missed by the initial investigation or whatever. The other thing I always like to do is videotape the crowds, see who's around, because that old adage, criminal returns to the scene of the crime is true in a lot of cases. That case that I had showed y'all earlier, that little store, that little grocery store back there, we were going back in there for our breaks, get a Coke, whatever it may be, taking breaks. But we later found out that several of the accused were in there actually trying to pick up information about what was going on at the scene. So like I said, they were in our midst, and and I had the idea at one point of say, hey, why don't we set up some video cameras on each side of the highway and catch the license plates of people who are coming through and see if anything of interest pops up. So again, there are other uses of videotape at the crime scene that can be used to advantage in the investigation. Now, photographs, they're a must. They preserve the details. And, you can never take too many photographs. We want as many photographs as possible. You don't need anything huge. 4 megapixels will actually do the trick. But nowadays we got 20 and 30 megapixel cameras that are they're still not quite to where film was, but they're getting close.
I've got to just say, because I'm so proud of it, I just bought, well, not just, it's about 9 months old now, the Sony Alpha 7R. It's the mirrorless, and it's a 48 megapixel.
Wow.
It's crazy good. It's as quality as any film that I ever shot.
Wow.
It is incredible.
Yeah, and that's one of the things, one of the keys, I think, in terms of, again, we talked about camera cell phones, using camera phones. and they have they're very limited in what they can do. You need, almost like a single lens reflex camera these days to properly do crime scenes. You want to have interchangeable lenses. I found that 28 to 105 millimeters was a good working range from wide angle to stuff that you can, take some good macro photographs with. It has to have macro capability. Want to make sure side mounted flashes are used because, as you know, trying to take a picture of a fingerprint or a footwear impression on a reflective surface, if you take a photograph right into that shiny surface, it's going to reflect right back into your camera and you're not going to get anything. Whereas with a side mounted flash, you can move the flash over to the side and bounce the flash off so it's not coming right into the
they've got the beautiful LED side mounts now that are a range of LEDs, and you can take them off, and you have your camera, and you can take the strip of LEDs and put them anywhere. The technology has advanced so much. They need to be using it.
Right, exactly. That's they need to use it, and they need to learn how to use it.
Exactly.
That's the thing. And of course, you're going to want to have scales for anything that has to have a scaled measurement, tripods, as well as an angle finder, because we talked about people not taking 90-degree photographs of blood stains and that sort of thing, and or any type of prints on smooth surfaces or footwear impressions. And I'm going to show you a couple of examples of that, some photos. Also, if you need an on-site photo printer, you can you could have that for instant prints, that if you got like a shoe print pattern and your people are running search warrants, they say, hey, this is the type of shoe we're looking for, see what you find. And so that can be of advantage. And again, with cell phones, again, it can be done with a cell phone, but again, I'm not a big fan of the cell phone at crime scenes because of security issues, as well as, who knows where this is going to end up, and what's the security associated with it.
But if you have to go out and do a search for like a pattern, it's nice to be able to do a text with that pattern so that those patrol officers have it very quickly.
Right. And again, if you got a secured line or you got a secured kind of cell phone network, I think that's okay, as long as like I said, they've got protections. But this day and age of how things get leaked out, and, gets, all over the internet. That's the kind of thing, that I'm thinking, you'd want to avoid as part of your investigation.
Sure.
But yeah, and I do see the advantages of that. Yeah, you could send it and mass text it to all your people who run the search warrants, and that, like I said, as long as it's on a secure network, I don't think it's an issue.
One of the things that I do also think that we miss quite a bit in Discovery is the text messages during a crime scene.
Mm.
And I think the text messages could be very revealing of, what's being done, what's being asked, who's being asked about it.
Right.
So I think that trying to obtain the text messages for that certain period of time that the crime scene was going on, I think can be quite valuable.
Yeah, and I agree. And again, you get into that distinction between, is it a personal cell phone or is it a department issued cell phone? And how many of them are going off the network so that they're not, that's not recorded.
If they were doing this crime scene with it, I don't think it should matter if it was personal or a agency phone. If they were using it to disseminate or gather information about the crime scene, I think that's up for grabs.
Yeah, I think so too. So the other thing, in taking photographs of crime scene, we want wide angle photos, kind of showing the overall scene, medium range photos, kind of showing how different pieces of evidence are kind of associated with one another. Then we want close up photographs, and then, if necessary, scaled photographs. Anything that's going to be for comparison purposes has to be scaled. One of the disadvantages and the shortcomings of photographs is what we're trying to do is we're trying to take a three-dimensional area and record it in 2 dimensions. So sometimes things aren't always as they appear, And I use this kind of to illustrate. You can see this grass that's clutched in this person's hand. When you look at it in this photograph, it looks markedly different than this photograph, okay? And again, that could be due to what we call parallax error, when the lens isn't
Right.
quite lined up. And again, you're compressing 3 dimensions into 2 dimensions, so things don't always necessarily come out the same in these photographs. But again, it's something that we want to be aware of, and to see if there are any discrepancies in how that scene was recorded, or if it was altered in some form or fashion.
And if you had just had the one photograph, you would never have been able to get the clarity of having multiple photographs at different positions.
Right, correct.
And
So
so
it's-
going back, that could take on a completely different meaning.
Correct, correct. Now, this is a case that I was asked to examine. It happened within the confines of I think it was a 6x12 jail cell. There were 4 people in the jail cell. 2 of the people beat another one of the people to death in the jail cell. This jail cell had no lights in it at all. The only video was outside the jail cell, so nobody knew what was going on. So I was requested to do a bloodstain pattern analysis of this jail cell, and these are the photographs that were provided.
Oh my God.
First of all, you can see the photographs are clearly out of focus. They have no value in terms of making any kind of bloodstain pattern determinations. This one, while it's in focus, there's we don't know if this is parallel to the surface or not. There's no scales, no rulers, and any of the blood stains up on the wall. We can't make any determinations of them because, again, the plane of the camera is not in the same plane or parallel to the same plane as the surface we're trying to photograph. So again, no value other than some maybe qualitative statements, and I wouldn't even go that far with some of these photographs. Here's another one. Again, no scale, not parallel, very limited to little information. If you look down kind of in the bottom right corner there, it appears there might even be a shoe print that could have been enhanced. It could have been photographed properly with a scale and with the camera, again, at 90 degrees to the surface, and we might have been able to make some sort of determinations from it. But again, we're only limited at what we
And
can do.
there's no excuse for this, George.
Exactly.
I've got several of these little bubbles. They're like the green level bubbles
Right.
that slide right onto the shoe
Yep.
of my camera.
I have the same thing.
My new camera, I don't need that because the camera itself inside, as I'm looking inside, tells me what angle I'm at. But on all my DSLRs, I have like probably 6 of these little levels that
Yep.
just flip into the shoe of the camera, and boom, there I have it.
Right.
And then in my little crime scene kit, there's always a roll of scales, of the tape scales, as well as numerous physical scales that I just have to, keep bleached and cleaned, because
Right.
that's another way that we're transferring DNA around all the time, and we've always got to be that always has to be present in our thinking when we're doing that. But there's no excuse for.
Right. Right. And this is what we have to deal with a lot of times,
Absolutely.
as you may know. We'll talk a little bit about sketches and diagrams. They may not be necessary in every case, but they are required if their spatial relationships are important, or proportional measurements in reconstructions. For instance, I use a lot of sketches in shooting reconstructions where we're trying to look at cartridge case patterns, where the shooter may potentially been when some of these shots were fired and that sort of thing. So they're important for that. They're important for bloodstain patterns. And like I said, primarily those are the 2 major things. Of course, it never hurts in any case to have a sketch. You typically have what's called an overhead sketch, where it looks like you're looking down on the surface, or you can have an elevation sketch, which is kind of like this, would be a sketch of this wall back here behind me. showing what diagramming things on that, those different items.
I'm seeing fewer and fewer sketches in my cases. I don't know if you are.
It's agency to agency. Some agencies, they seem to do a lot of sketching and they'll sketch everything. Others, you're right. I don't see it in some agencies at all. And I think it's very critical, especially like I said, in a lot of these cases that I look at are like shooting reconstruction cases. And if you don't have, good sketches and diagrams, then you're not going to be able to make any, little to no determinations about those scenes.
And that's another thing to put in the discovery motion, that you want all the sketches that were made by any person that was there.
Correct. And you're going to start off with a rough sketch, hopefully that'll evolve to a final sketch. But again, just like Laura said, you're also going to want to get those copies as well of that, from the rough sketch to the final sketch, maybe some valuable information in there. We also have to keep in mind, it's not a blueprint. Okay. It's not an exacting, but although nowadays with these 3D scanners, you do get down to millimeters of precision on some of these things. So, eventually those 3D scanners, and again, I'm not seeing this in the majority of cases. I'm seeing it with some of the larger agencies that when I look at casework from, but I'm not seeing it a whole lot in the smaller agencies in terms of these, 3D programs and scanners. But again, with those, you can get precise millimeter difference, down to millimeters.
However, just to go into that, I don't know if your talk goes into 3D or if this is about as much as we're going to talk about it.
This is about as much as we're going to get into.
Let me just ask you or suggest, in my experience, the 3D imaging can be extremely problematic if, again, the person that is performing the measurements and getting all of that, it does not know how to use the technology.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
And
have to
then
be
it can be extremely misleading to the point that one case just got approved, and it's the first case that I know of, got approved in Oklahoma, I believe, for a reenactment utilizing 3D scanning and animation.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is rife with problems. It's kind of like it's kind of like probabilistic genotyping, right? You always have to put your thoughts in there before the computer takes over and gives you and spits out the information.
Right.
Be it the animation or the likelihood ratio.
I think it has its purpose in terms of documenting structures and where evidence is, but you're right, it gets problematic in terms of when you're trying to do an actual animation, showing the movement of people and where they may have fired guns and that sort of thing. I think then it can be problematic, but I think just as strictly a documentation tool, I think it's okay. But like I said, I think when it comes down to the actual reconstruction, then that has to be really scrutinized and see if that fits with all of the evidence that's been gathered in that case.
And I think that is going to be a lot of litigation for our audience. Is we're going to have to ask for the software, because all of these 3D imaging has different software that they work off of, and there's not one expert that can have all of the software.
Right.
So the software is going to have to become available, and a lot of that's going to be proprietary.
Yeah.
Just like remember Colorado with the proprietary information of Promega for DNA, and the judge threw out several cases before Promega gave that information over.
Right.
And I think that type of information is critical to see what the user is putting in for the variables.
Right.
And if a variable changed, what would change in the final product?
Right. And it's same thing with, like you said, probabilistic genotyping, star mix, true allele. You know, they can't, no one can get the proprietary information, although I think there have been a couple of exceptions
I think
where
Star Mix, but
they've
True Allele hasn't given it up at all.
they haven't, yeah.
No,
And so,
not to my knowledge anyway.
yeah, and so, you know, you want to look and see what, you know, what exactly they're telling the algorithms to do, because the algorithms are put in based on human experience. So,
Exactly,
yeah,
exactly. And you are always accounting for the known samples. You're
right.
always putting those in.
Yeah,
And that in itself is it's a bias for the algorithm to run.
right. So, but that's I guess a different CLE for a different
Yes,
day.
yes. Sorry.
That's okay.
I'll get Baby Yoda, and Baby Yoda and I will sit back and listen to the rest.
I'm just kidding. Um, this is just a sketch that I did. It was a police officer involved shooting. Just kind of a, you know, back then pen and ink, you know, and graph paper, and just kind of showing the shooting. The kind of square you see to the left side with the crosshatch pattern. That was a combination of the trajectories as well as the cartridge casing patterns to show where the officer was most likely when several of the shots were fired. But again, you know, this you might see something like this, a rough sketch. They've got computer-aided diagramming. You know, you may get something nice like this if you have the money and the software to do it. So we may see things like this, a little bit more three-dimensional. But it's all based on, again, two-dimensional measurement. I mean, not two-dimensional. It's based on hand measurements from the scene, this particular one, and not generated from a 3D scanner or anything like that. The other thing we want to look at is we want to look at the notes and chain of custody. And again, you know, one of the policies and procedures should be that they should be taking plenty of relevant notes about the scene. And you know, back whenever we do crime scenes, we record all that information while we're out there, our observations. You know, we want to try to avoid using subjective information, record what we see, not what we think it means. And if we do have some information that's coming to us, make sure, you know, if someone's telling us this, make sure we record the source of that information, so that if a first responding officer tells someone, one of CSIs at the scene, that information should be documented so it can be tracked back down to that particular individual. You know, you can't just put out there, oh, I heard that there was, you know, casings found under this couch kind of thing. It has to be, you have to have the source as to who provided that. So
And
again,
if you get in early enough, make sure that the handwritten notes are not destroyed. Get
correct.
the handwritten notes if you get into the case early enough.
Right, right. And again, a good preservation order would hopefully cover all that information. And again, you know, you want to make sure there's a good chain of custody and get signatures that you know, make sure that there is a documented chain of custody. And you know, I don't think this might be something that, I don't know how much people look at chain of custody these days in terms of you know, in terms of looking at, you know, and tracking down every piece of evidence and seeing where it went, when, that sort of thing. I think that's sort of getting lost these days. I don't know what your experience has been, Laura, in terms of that.
I've had this argument, George, so recently and so many times. You know, we were taught that chain of custody, I mean, it has to be solid.
Right.
And that's what we were taught. And I'm not seeing that anymore. I see a great chain when it gets to the lab.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And so the lab chain of custody is terrific. And in our discovery now, I get chain of custody documentation, but it's just the lab chain of custody documentation. I don't have any chain, for the most part, I'm not getting chain of custody from the scene to the property room, from the property room to wherever. If I do get that, it is often broken, and broken severely.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that anymore, unfortunately, it's going to the weight. And so that's what I'm being told often, is that it goes to the, I mean, I'm not a lawyer. I may have stayed at a Holiday Inn once, but that I'm not a lawyer. But that disturbs me a lot because of how drilled into us the chain of custody was. And I'm seeing chain of custody all over the place now that is not good chain of custody. And it's even more concerning in this day and age when True Allele just a couple months ago developed a 10-person mixture.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So I look at that, and then you and I have so many disciplines that we're competent in and qualified in that immediately takes me back to the crime scene and the chain of custody.
Right.
I'm getting a 10-person mixture off of True Allele. What's happening with the chain of custody? And I just don't see a focus on it.
Yeah, and that's where, especially nowadays we're talking about indirect DNA transfer. We want to see exactly where that evidence was. How did it move, through the process? Did the two items come within contact, or around one another? When did that happen? Was it possible that one of the bags was open at the time that this was happening? So there's still a lot of relevant information, and I agree with you that seems like I'm seeing less and less. It's very detailed, the stuff I get from the lab. You know exactly where it's been because of the limb systems.
Right.
As far as before it gets to the lab, you're right. We want to know exactly where that evidence moved and how it moved and who had it and that sort of thing.
I'm getting reports that talk about, now, of course, it's not in a chain, but I'm getting reports that talk about packaging the evidence at the property room.
Yeah.
From the crime scene. Well,
yeah.
How the hell did you get it to the property room?
Right.
Was it all just put in the back of the scout car?
Yeah.
And then you just, with the same clothes that you had on, you just grabbed it all up in your arms and took it and then packaged it piece by piece. I mean, all of the evidence should be collected and sealed at the crime scene. Packaged and sealed at the crime scene. And that's not being done.
Right. Now, there are going to be certain exceptions to that. Like if you have something that's like large and bloody, like a bloody comfort.
I absolutely agree. That needs to be dried or something like that.
Right.
Absolutely. But getting it from the scene to the property room, to a drying room, I mean, all of that needs to be documented.
Absolutely.
And I don't think that we give an inch on that because it is so important once you get to the conclusions that the laboratory makes.
Absolutely. Okay. Now, after we've done all our initial things, we've what we say so far, we've gathered information, we've conducted the walkthrough, we've documented the evidence. Then we're going to want to collect and preserve the evidence. And again, collect in a logical manner. Don't be running from one area to the other, causing potential cross-contamination. Also we want to continue taking photographs, especially if you're uncovering layers of evidence. You may need to continue to photograph. Proper collection containers need to be used. The evidence needs to be labeled thoroughly. That's one of my pet peeves, especially stuff I get here at our lab, is that sometimes the lab is not, the evidence is not properly labeled, and I have to end up calling the agency, say, well, where did this come from? Who is this, who's this associated with? What type of examination should I be conducting on this item? We also want to make sure they pay attention to the most discriminating evidence, which are going to be, of course, things like DNA, fingerprints, those sorts of things, firearms evidence, shoe print evidence. And also they want to make sure that they're preserving crime scene reconstruction information that can be useful, again, especially from a defense perspective. A lot of times, most times the state doesn't seem to really care about the reconstruction information, but the defense does, because they may want to know specifically who was shooting where. It may, go to the charges that are being filed and that sort of thing. So want to make sure that all this is collected and preserved properly.
And you say to continue to photograph. I was trained and continued to do this for, the last 25 years, is is you continue to photograph each part of the scene. You
Mhm.
photograph it right when you get there to preserve it. Then you photograph each piece of evidence. Then you photograph how it looks after it was
Right.
collected. Um, and I may see photographs of the scene, and that's about it anymore. They may take a picture of an item that they're going to collect, but they don't, or a marker that they have a placard on it, but they're not taking photographs afterwards
Yeah.
or how the scene looked after they left,
Right.
which is not documenting what was done in the scene.
Yeah. And I even from a, a perspective of law enforcement, I think that would be in their best interest in terms of liability issues as well. Saying, no, somebody making a claim that that law enforcement left the scene in a certain way. Well, if you've got photographs showing how you left it, after you completed the scene, I think
You're covered.
it's valuable. Yeah.
And it's the same way. If you don't do it, then you are going to get on the stand and say, well, I did this and this and this, but yeah, it wasn't photographed. And you also maybe had a few other mistakes on the scene.
Yeah.
How is that finder of fact, or how is the defense supposed to believe that?
Right.
And it goes back to the mistakes becoming conspiracy.
Right.
And it's unfortunate, but if you don't do it correctly, there has to be an accountability for it.
Right.
So I think it's crucial.
Yeah, absolutely. Collection containers, again, you want the right type of evidence in the right type of container. Mostly paper is what's going to be used, again, for biological evidence. Although I still get people, putting biological evidence in plastic. It's still a thing to this day, and even though we've been preaching that for the last 35 years. For small items that are easily lost, trace things, they need to use paper packets that they can then put in envelopes. Most things need to be air dried. Of course, everything should be packaged separately. You need proper containers to hold any liquids that might be of value. Arson evidence should be put in, clean paint type cans that can be sealed and hold in any potential accelerants or volatiles that may be present. You also want to, one of the things I like to emphasize is, broken glass and sharp objects, especially for the people who are opening the evidence later on. That needs to be packaged in a way that it's not going to be a hazard to someone else when they open it. And again, you need to evaluate your evidence and try and, kind of figure out if it may be something off the wall, you got to figure out how it's going to be the best way to collect it and the best thing to put it in. As far as labeling evidence, what I like to see is what's in the container, where was it recovered, who recovered it, when was it recovered, the case number, the file number, make sure everything's all within the same case, and any other necessary information that the person may need to put in that may help the person who's actually doing the examination of the evidence.
And I'm seeing less and less of this.
Oh, I see it all the time. Yes.
And nowadays, one detective, the detective in charge of the crime scene, his or her name is the only name that's on that bag, whether
Right.
he or she collected it or not. And so I don't ever really know on these cases that are like that. I don't ever really know who collected it.
Right.
And then 3 years down the road, they don't know.
Right.
And how is that fair to the justice system?
Yeah, it's not. That's one of the things, like I said, this is the same lecture I give to law enforcement, try and hammer it home how important it is to label it. And like I said, still we get things in the lab that I have to make a phone call on to find out, okay, where did this come from? How does this fit in? Who, where was it collected? How does it, relate to what the questions we're trying to answer here, essentially.
Yeah, a 3,000 square foot house, and I have sock from bedroom.
Yeah.
There's 4 bedrooms, but that's all I have on the package, sock
Right.
from bedroom.
Yep, exactly. Just a little bit talk about some contamination issues, mostly pertaining, of course, to DNA type evidence. There are several types of contamination, mostly personal contamination, where person collecting the evidence contaminates the evidence. And we have seen this, I've seen it as far as recent as just some of the most recent cases I've looked at for the defense, where we found some contamination. Also cross-contamination, where one sample contaminates another sample. And again, you tie that into indirect transfer, where evidence, a person may not have even come in contact with evidence, and yet their DNA is found on that evidence.
I think we use contamination as almost a swear word, a dirty word, right? It's for all the time that I've been in forensics, contamination is, oh my God, the alarms go off, the sirens go off. But now I try to phrase it, because of what we know in the research and the treatises that are out there. What we know is that it really is contamination, but instead of using contamination, I talk about transfer.
Right.
Because
Right.
it is the exact same thing. It just doesn't raise the alarms and make people so terribly defensive.
Right.
I
That's a
found
good
that.
point. That's a very good point.
But I think that contamination is contamination. We can phrase it as transfer to make everybody calm down a little bit.
Right.
But that's what we're talking about, is bringing in other, and for DNA, it's an easy example, bringing in DNA where it does not belong.
Right. And it's a fact of life that it happens,
Yep.
One way or the other, either intentionally or unintentionally.
But we know how to minimize it.
Right.
And I've got one scene that in their report, they said that they change gloves after each piece of evidence, which is certainly what you want to read in a report.
Mm-hmm.
However, the thousands of photographs from that crime scene, you can tell by different marks and stuff on the gloves that they weren't changed. You also can tell that there's no depository for used gloves,
Yeah.
and there are no glove boxes anywhere within the scene.
Yeah.
So you know that is actually not true.
Right. And
it was not done.
Right.
And you can prove it with their own photos.
Right.
And that's one of the things that, it was a horrible crime scene. We didn't think about it. Yeah, we use the same gloves. Why go back and report that you change gloves during each piece of evidence? Just because that's what you were supposed to do.
Right.
You didn't do it. It's obvious. You can catch yourselves on the body cameras and on the physical photos that nobody had boxes of gloves. There was not a container that people were putting used gloves in. And even with the sequencing on the metadata, you know how hot those crime scenes are. And unless you have I have cotton liners, so I can get my gloves on easier after I start perspiring on my hands. But there's no way that with the short time frame of the metadata, that evidence could have been collected with a change of gloves.
Right. Right.
So there's a whole bunch of issues, and that is contamination, or that causes contamination or transfer.
Right. Again, want to avoid, personal contamination, wear a mask. In this, it says if you have a cold. I think nowadays it's just prudent a lot of times, if you're dealing with any type of potential contact DNA evidence, that you wear a mask anyway. And of course, disposable gloves, and change frequently, like we just talked about. And this is kind of an obvious one, and I don't think I've encountered it recently. Although there have been some cases where, you want to package everything separately, but you obviously don't want to package a whole bunch of different stuff together that's from disparate scenes and that sort of thing. So we want to make sure that things are packaged separately. I don't recall any recent cases where it was an egregious thing. Usually when I find them packaged together, it's usually when they're found together, people will package them all together.
I'm still seeing stuff that several items packaged together that came from different. Yeah, absolutely should have been separate.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, it's essential that, we have items that are from different scenes and individuals be packaged separately. Um, you know, again, have different people maybe working different aspects of the scene. That way we can at least minimize it and prevent contamination and secondary transfer. Again, what we just talked about, always change gloves between exhibits. And according to packaging, the worst things for DNA evidence is heat, moisture. It's going to, of course, cause things to degrade and break down. And again, that's why I always say don't package in plastic. And contact DNA, again, that's where people have come in contact with surfaces. Touch DNA, it's also called trace DNA. And again, this type of DNA is also ripe for secondary transfer. I mean, as few as 20 cells, you can produce theoretically a complete profile. At least as few as 6 cells to produce a partial profile. Always wear gloves and masks. Use
Well,
sterile.
I'm sorry.
No,
In
no.
my STR, what we're finding is, we're talking about picograms here, and you're looking at very minimal amounts with Ys.
Right. And just for picograms is like, what is it, 1/1000th of a gram, or is that?
So we do 1 nanogram per microliter is our target, right?
Right.
So it's a picogram is 100th of that.
1,000th.
1,000th of
Yeah.
that. Sorry, 1,000th of that.
And let me see, it's microgram. It goes microgram, milligram, microgram, nanogram. So that's a billion. I think a picogram is actually a trillionth of a gram, something along those lines. So yeah,
Okay.
It's very, very sensitive.
And that's what we're looking at oftentimes, like 20 picograms, right?
Right.
When we've got 0.002 nanograms.
Right. Oh, hey.
Yeah.
You got a visitor.
This is why it's not formal. This is why we don't have our suits on and we're not in Las Vegas.
Who is that?
This is Mungo Jerry.
Oh, I like Mungo Jerry.
She's my helper.
What's the song Mungo Jerry used to sing? The Summertime, something like that?
Yeah, and her sister, she had a sister up till 5 years ago that looked just like her, and that was Rumpel Teaser.
Oh.
From T.S. Eliot, Mungo Jerry, and Rumpel Teaser.
Nice.
So.
All right. Let's see.
But I think that if you want to go back to that slide,
yeah.
I think that, and even go over Lockhardt's principle, if you would, because every police officer should know, and in a pretrial interview, if an officer does not want to admit that transfer does happen, I think you go over Lockhardt's principle with them.
Right. Yeah, Locard's principle is every contact leaves a trace. And Edmond Locard was a criminalist, a French criminalist back in the early 1900s, I believe, was when he was around. And he came up with this theory that anytime anybody comes in contact with a scene, they're going to leave a little bit of themselves behind, as well as take something from the scene with themselves. Well, now we know, extended beyond that you can take that stuff from the scene and actually deposit it somewhere else. So Locard, didn't realize exactly the magnitude of his transfer theory back then. So yeah, but
I don't know any police department that doesn't teach Lockhardt's principle in their academy.
They should, they should if they're not. But yeah, I agree. I think that's the basis of all criminalistics, essentially.
So I think that's always important.
Right. This kind of concludes the portion of the going through kind of things. The rest are case examples. I don't know in terms of how much time we want to go, or what's your thoughts on that, Laura?
If you have time, George, I would love to go through some of these case examples.
Okay. Yeah, I think
I think that I'm just very appreciative to you and NACDL for getting CLE training out to folks that are like all of us in self-isolation.
Right.
And so I would certainly appreciate that if you have some time.
Yeah, I think we're right about 2.5 hours. I think is that right, according to your clock. And I
Yeah,
think,
and we had a little chat beforehand, so I think we're good.
okay, yeah, okay, we'll go ahead and I'll go ahead and do a couple of cases, and we'll see. You know, we'll kind of go from there. And I don't think I'll be able to get through all of them, but we'll go through as many as we can.
Okay, I will try not to interrupt.
Okay, like I said, these are all just going to be case examples, things that I've, having worked for the defense, these are all defense cases, and to where scene information, we're able to take some of that scene information and, you know, use it to their advantage in terms of, you know, getting their clients some relief, at least from maybe some of the charges, or, you know, some of the more egregious things, and help the defense out.
I think anytime that we can put our real world cases and show our practice in a real world setting is helpful.
Okay. All right. This first case is a case of a shoe print that was found on a door. And I was contacted by the attorneys, and they were claiming it was a home invasion type case. They claimed that their client was not the one who had, you know, committed this home invasion, that it was actually his partner, and his partner was the one who had kicked in the door. And there was a discrepancy in the shoe size between the two. The client in this case wore like, I think he's wore like a size 9 shoe, whereas the other participant wore a size like 14 shoe, something along those lines. So it became important for the attorneys to try and ascertain who this shoe print belonged to. And this is initially what I was provided. And, you know, it wasn't a lot of information. I wasn't hopeful at first. Now, again, we can see it's got a ruler in it. It's taken properly. You know, it was documented very well. First thing I was trying to do was trying to figure out what type of shoe this was, see if I could make any determinations on its size. And this was about my only clue, and it took me a while to kind of try and figure out what these letters were. But eventually I was able to figure out it was USPA, United States Polo Association, which is a brand. And I was able to take the original photograph that I had, which was this of the shoe, and I was able to take it in Photoshop, and you can kind of see there, right, there's kind of a square in the middle of the shoe, and that's where that USPA was. But it took me a while to find that. And then, so what I was able to do was to darken the photo some using Photoshop, and you can see it kind of pops now to USPA. And what I was able to do was I went online and I found what types of shoes these were. I was able to scan like a lot of their shoe sole patterns that were online, and eventually found what looked like the pair, or what looked like one of the makes of the shoe. And what I did then was I went to one of the local sporting goods stores that carries a lot of shoes, and found these shoes, and found them ranging from I believe it was size 10 through 14. And so what I did then was I created exemplars from those shoes that I had gotten from the store, and I was able to take measurements at different. I took measurements at different points, and you can kind of see the measurement A, B, and C. We're taking measures of those kind of ridges along the side. D was taking it from the base of this of the bottom of the square where the USPA was to the edge of the circle, and then also from the other corner to that same edge, to try and get some measurements to see if I could maybe take measurements from the knowns and then compare that to the unknown to see what the possible shoe size was. And so this was kind of a chart that I came up with. I had, like I said, shoes from size 10 through 14. The A, B, C, D, and E represent the different measurements I had taken of the shoe. I was then able to do what we call a linear regression on it, and determine that based on the size of the shoe, based on the different measurements that we had, that it was most likely a size 12 to 14 shoe that created that, as opposed to the 9 to 10 shoe. So again, that provided defense with some information that, you know, this was most likely not their client's shoe, but the other individual who was charged in the case. But again, this case did take some work. And again, it was taken directly from some evidence from the crime scene that we're able to make these determinations and use these measurements to try and ascertain the shoe size. And it's also something a little different than your everyday DNA stuff. It's a little, something you don't see too much every day. It's footwear type measurements.
A little fun project.
Right, exactly. This was another case. This was a shotgun killing of a woman in her house. The story was that her and her husband were cleaning out a gun cabinet. They were taking stuff out. She was in the gun cabinet. She had handed the husband one of the shotguns, and he said that he racked one of the shells out, and then he racked the next one in, and the gun accidentally went off and killed her, shot her in the back of the head. And you can kind of see this is a very bloody scene. You can see the shotgun shells near her left hand, some of the shotgun shells from the gun cabinet. But you can also see, like I said, pieces of skull here and there, as well as, like I said, a lot of blood stains. This was the gun cabinet itself that they were cleaning out. If you look at the lower bottom portion of the photograph, you can see her foot where the shotgun was lying. And this was as a result of that shotgun blast. You could see all the skin, the blood, the hair that exited from the high velocity blast of the shotgun. This was up on the ceiling. It almost literally rained blood in this house. And you can see here also, if you look over to the left of where that photograph kind of is, there's a very fine misting pattern there, again indicating that blood was very much aerosolized when it struck that particular surface. But one of the things that I thought was curious, and that wasn't done at the scene, and again, this is information we have now lost because nobody thought of it at the scene at the time. But the shotgun shell, where he's claiming that he ejected it from the shotgun, one of the things that could have been looked at, had they examined this floor carefully, you could see blood stains on the kind of on the wall there, on that closet door, on the magazine. I mean, on the butt of the rifle. One of the things they could have looked for was to see if there was blood spatter underneath that shotgun shell, or if there was blood spatter on top of it, because that would then be able to tell, one way or the other, which way the shotgun. Excuse me 1 second.
You bet.
Yes. Okay, y'all have a good day. Bye-bye.
We had some calls, you wrote them down. Yes.
Okay, thanks, appreciate it. Nothing important, right? Nothing about urgent. Okay, great. Y'all have a good evening. That was my two cats that came in. But again, had someone looked at the scene, this may have, cleared up, may have shown that he was telling the truth based on just these blood stains, or, if maybe he wasn't, if maybe the scene was staged. So again, but because that wasn't done, we'll never know. So again, it goes back to that limitation of what can and should be done at a crime scene, and sometimes thinking outside the box and recognizing what is evidence. So here's a close-up of it again, but again, it's just not good enough to tell if there's potential blood stains underneath that carpet or not, underneath that shell. This is one I call the case of the questionable cleanup. This was a man who was stabbed allegedly by two individuals in this apartment. The two clients were being charged with his murder, but the prosecution was trying to tack on some additional charges in terms of altering the scene and saying that they cleaned up part of the scene. And like I said, I think they were just trying to enhance the charges to try and get them more time. And so what they were alleging was that the scene was cleaned up and that they had altered evidence as part of this cleanup. But when we began looking at the scene, he was stabbed. You can see clearly there's a large pool of blood there, kind of in the area, and you can see there's some rags there that may or may not have been used to to try and clean up, or may have been used to try and stave off his bleeding. But you can also see the medical interventions that occurred. So we know where there's going to be some scene alteration there because of that. But where this shows, you can see the stab wound in his upper chest there, his upper chest area. But one of the things we notice is that he doesn't have any type of blood dripping off his fingers in that area. His hands are pretty clean. Same thing with this other hand. There's a little bit of transfer blood on his wrist, but we don't see anything running down his arm kind of thing. And so it looks like everything is pretty much confined to that area where this took place. Again, he doesn't have any blood stains on his pants, indicating that he was moving around or he was dragged or moved or anything along those lines. We do have a bloody imprint on the wall here. We don't know what the meaning of that was. We don't know if that's old or new blood, if they typed it, or what. It was never exactly analyzed. I don't even think it was collected. Where they were coming at with this cleanup issue was the crime scene investigators went in and they put down leucocrystal violet, which is, Laura, you know, is a blood enhancing reagent that you can spray, and if there's latent bloody impressions, it'll show up. This is another close-up, kind of that blood stain on the wall, maybe a palm print. But this is the area that they hit this with, and you can kind of see there are some possible shoe prints or footprints here, and also around this garbage bag.
No oblique lighting.
No oblique lighting at all. And again, you can kind of see maybe some light, what might be blood stains here. And this is what happened after they hit it with this leucocrystal violet. What they're alleging is that these blood stains were part of this entire incident where this guy was killed. But if we look at that, again, we have all this. First of all, they did this, but they never collected any of the samples. They never typed it. They never species typed it. These people hunted, they fished. So, it's potential. This could be animal blood. This could be fish blood from when they were, this was, again, this is another case from South Louisiana where they may have, they have a certain lifestyle, hunting outdoor lifestyle that, there was no follow-up with this. And again, here, this is kind of the area that we have here. This is kind of over this closest area at the bottom of the screen is closest to the sink area. And his body is found at the far end of the photograph in that other room. And you can see there is no sort of drip patterns anywhere over there. You have a couple of these impressions, which again, we don't know if they're associated with this or not. But yeah, we're able to show that because of the blood staining where he was, that was primarily where he was killed. And all this was, it had really nothing to do with his murder. Because again, there wasn't anything dripping off of him to create these type of patterns. And this, again, must have been from some other incident. But again, nobody bothered to collect this. Nobody did any follow-up testing to show whether this was, the case or not. And that, again, had it been tested, it may have shown that, hey, this had nothing to do with the crime.
And I think that, just because it turns pretty purple, and they want to make a good picture for the jury, it means absolutely nothing until serology and DNA is performed.
Correct.
And I mean, this could be, when you take a steak out,
Right.
and you're taking it over to the garbage bin,
Right.
and you've got that drip trail that's going over to the garbage bin or out by the grill or wherever. To a jury, when they make it pretty, or when they turn all the lights off and they make it, luminesce, that looks great in a crime scene. But it can mean absolutely nothing.
Right. And one of the things is, Laura, these presumptive tests all have false positives associated with them. There are other things that will cause these reactions, these blood-like reactions. That's why we have to run confirmatory tests and run DNA analysis on it to determine, if
I harp on that all the time, George. They're non-specific presumptive tests.
Right.
And unless a confirmatory test has been done, don't even try to insinuate what biological fluid that you're dealing with.
Absolutely. This is a case, this was a shooting reconstruction case that occurred. It was a deal where there was an incident where some people were eating at like an Applebee's, and the victim in this case, she came over and confronted her ex-boyfriend. It had spilled out into this parking lot. There was a lot of confusion, a lot of mayhem. A gun was produced. She was shot and killed. At that point, all the people who were there kind of scattered. Someone came along and actually stole the gun. They had that on, I think that portion of it they might have had on videotape. I don't think they didn't have the actual shooting itself on videotape, but I think they had actually saw somebody walking off with the gun from the scene. So the gun just literally walked away from the scene.
Anybody related to the scene or just a bystander?
I don't know. It's just like I said,
Wow.
it was just a melee. But one of the things we looked at in this case, because the accused story in this case was that there was some eyewitness testimony that he pointed the gun at her. And Laura, as you know, when I do these shooting reconstructions, I find that almost all the eyewitnesses are absolutely wrong in what happened. I've examined, like I said, several shootings where I've compared that to the eyewitness statements and found that, like I said, most of the time they get it wrong. So what we did was we looked at this case and we had some measurements.
That's an entirely different CLE that we should think about doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So we had some measurements of the entrance wound and the exit wound. So what I was able to do is I was able to model that using some software here. And this kind of shows the trajectory of the wound. And you can see this is kind of a front view. And then we have a side view here. And you can see it's at a slightly upward angle. And that becomes significant. It wasn't hugely upward, but based on the measurements from the autopsy, we were able to kind of show it was at a slightly upward angle. And this is kind of the overhead view. And this was their height disparity. The accused in this case was 5'9". The victim in this case was 4'9". Okay, so this becomes kind of important in terms of how pointing the gun and all that works out. So this is what it would be like if he, according to the witnesses, if he extended his arm straight, it would be at a downward angle he would have to fire, given at this particular distance. And we do have some caveats to this reconstruction a little bit. And this is kind of an overhead view of what it would look like, again, if he had a bent arm, if the gun was fired sort of from the hip, and kind of like in this. But again, here, even the trajectory is not quite right. Although, in order to get the trajectory right, this would be what it would be like if his wrist was flexed upward a little bit. You can see that would work, kind of an upward shot. But again, based on what the witnesses were saying, he's saying straight arm extended. His story was that the gun had fallen out at some point. Again, we don't know what happened to the gun, but he said he was picking it up, and he claims that as he picked it up, he either accidentally pulled the trigger, the gun went off, something along those lines. And kind of when you look at his, the possibilities of what it could be, it could be his wrist was flexed upward. It could be that he was closer to her, but then again, the lack of information that should have been there. They did no distance determinations on her clothing to see how far away it may have been. So if it was closer, then that would change the angle, but then we would have residues. And the other possibility is that he was in a crouched position, like he talked about, and we're able to kind of demonstrate what this might look like if he was coming up from a crouched position and the gun went off, like he said. So this is what it would be like. So again, this provides some possibilities as to what, may have happened, and, was able to provide the defense this information that they did find helpful to the case.
And without the gun, you don't know the weight of the trigger pull or
if it's
any
defective,
of that.
Yeah, if there's a defect in the gun or anything, without having the gun, we don't know.
and so all the assumptions can be made by the prosecution and the police officers as to you know, what a normal, you know, trigger pull is, the pounds of pressure that it takes. But, you know, I, for one, uh, know how easy it is to go to a gunsmith and have them drop that poundage.
Right. Mhm.
I know that because I've got arthritis now.
Yeah.
And so it's much harder unless I have a gunsmith uh, decrease that for me.
Right.
But the gunsmith that I go to in Phoenix, he's doing that not just for me. He's got a stack of guns that he's doing that for a ton of clients.
Right.
So it's not unusual to see that in a legally possessed handgun. And certainly once you go to illegal handguns, unless you have the gun, you truly don't know what condition it's in.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And like I said, the defense found this helpful to them because had it not been done, then, you know, they would have been left with this thing that, you know, this witness statement saying that the gun was pointed straight at her. But we were able to clearly show in this case, because of their size disparities, that this is a possibility.
And one of the things is nobody wants to try, and I'm not saying my audience, and I'm not saying you, George, but I see that the day and age that you try to corroborate the suspect story is over.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we were trained, if we had information when I was in the lab, try to corroborate the suspect story as well,
Yeah.
if you can, you know, and I never see that happening anymore.
Yeah. No, the only people that are doing it are the defense, you know.
Exactly.
Yeah. And like I said, we're kind of stuck with what we have available to us, you know, based on what everybody else has done. You're hoping that they did the case correctly.
And during the collection, they're not trying to corroborate the suspect story, and
Right.
that limits anybody looking at it for the defense. It is very limiting,
Right.
which is very unfortunate.
Yeah. Okay, this is one that I found of interest, that this was where a crime scene reconstruction by the government was attempted 1 year after the fact. Okay. This shooting
And this is fairly recent.
Yes. This shooting involved a husband and wife. The wife was a postal carrier. She came home like for lunch or was out running her route and stopped. He claimed that he had an AR-15 rifle that was sitting up on a next to a like a post on a porch, and he claims that he went inside. She was at her truck, and the gun fell over and discharged and hit her and killed her. Okay, so that's his story. The government or the state has all this. They had this scene at the time, and they didn't do anything in terms of any type of shooting reconstruction. So what they did was they attempted it a year later. And this kind of just shows a kind of a timeline involved in this case. You know, and about 11:35, fire department responded to the shooting. Next morning at 9:15, they did the autopsy on the victim in this case, alleged victim. At 11:18 a.m., the scene was turned over to the FBI. Now, the FBI special agents had bullet trajectory training. They took measurements, but they didn't conduct a shooting reconstruction at the time. Okay, they got the training. Everything's there. You know, they take measurements. So it
Was
sits
any trajectory taken at the autopsy?
Yes, there was
Okay.
trajectory information at the autopsy.
Okay.
So almost a year later, let me see, you know, we're starting back, well, actually more than a year later, we're starting back in March of 2016. In July of 2017 is when the shooting reconstruction is done. So The postal truck, which has been sitting in a lot somewhere for the last, year or whatever, is made operational, and the tires are inflated. The tires had flattened at the time. So on July 7th, based on the measurements by the FBI, it's put in exact placement. That's the words of the crime scene reconstruction, at its original position on that day. Okay, so you can already see this is sort of rife with problems. They used 3 points for the reconstruction. There was a bullet impact in the truck, which they use as their exit final point. There was a bullet entrance on the mannequin with the approximate height, again, approximate height of the alleged victim in this case, and the bullet exit on the mannequin. Okay, so that's their 3 points that they're using for this trajectory reconstruction. So already we have issues, tire pressure. I mean, that can, raise or lower a car by an inch, which in the course, which may not seem like much at the outset, but when you talk about trajectories that are spanned over, several 50, 100 feet, then there can be huge variations by the time you get to the actual where the shooter would have been, or where the gun accidentally fell over, depending on the scenario. And again, how precise were the crime scene measurements? What were they using to make their crime scene measurements, and how accurately can that be put back into place a year later? Okay. So we got the accuracy of the measurements and the placement of the vehicle, and here you can kind of see where they've put everything, and they got a mannequin with the approximate height, again, not knowing exactly how tall this mannequin is. So they set up this reconstruction, and this is from the porch. If you look at kind of the center bottom, you can see the gun actually lying there on that case of soft drinks, and you can kind of see that red mark there is actually the string that they use for their trajectory. So this was her footwear. Again, I don't know if that was taken into account. Might give her an inch or two tall or whatever. In as part of this reconstruction. These are the trajectory rods placed in the mannequin. You can kind of see, and you can kind of see the curvature of the line there a little bit. So there's some issues. I mean, here they're using their trajectory rod placed on top of this bottle of water, which isn't actually necessarily the best way to stabilize that rod. So again, this shows just.
Is this the FBI doing this?
No. The FBI had the training, had the ability, had everything to do it at the time it occurred.
Chose not to.
Did not. They called out a private company to come out and do this reconstruction a year later. Okay.
Wow.
All right. So this is, there was some bullet destabilization that occurred. And we know that because of the impact mark. You kind of see that impact mark underneath. They're holding the actual recovered bullet right below the impact mark in the thing. Now, the problem with that is, as you know, Laura, is that when a bullet exits something and it's destabilized, it may not necessarily be traveling in a straight line anymore, because it's going to be tumbling and it's going to be arcing. So, but it's a short distance. It may still be straight, but we don't know. Again, it's another unknown variable in this year later reconstruction. Now, the angle measurements during the reconstruction, their angle measurement showed is at approximately 6.5 degree angle, okay, based on the rod. So this is kind of what we had some projected lines here of 6.5 degrees, and the margin of error for this test is plus or minus 5 degrees, okay, according to the literature. And I don't know if that is just a number somebody's pulled out of their hat, if there's some actual data behind that, but you can see at just 2 degrees difference between 6.5 degrees and 4.5 degrees that trajectory could pass right where those Coke cans were, because that was the story.
Difference.
Yeah, and that was the story, was that it fell over and landed on top of this pallet of soft drinks. That's why they brought the soft drinks out here. But that would fall within the range of it falling over and discharging. Now, when we look at the actual string measurements that they took, it indicates an approximate 10 degrees angle. Okay, so we could do that by taking the measurement of where they took one measurement here, and then they took another measurement here, and we could do use a little trigonometry and determine the angle. And the angle comes out to approximately 10 degrees, which is different than 6.5 degrees. So already we've got disparities in the measurements, and and again, the state was using this to try and prove that he fired this gun from the porch area deliberately at his wife. And you could see the gun resting on the flat of Coke cans, which again, with the margin of error of the 6.5 degrees, actually falls within that potential range.
And does that have a suppressor on it?
I think it's a flash suppressor. I don't know if it's an actual sound suppressor.
Okay.
I don't recall specific. I think come to think of it, it might have been a sound suppressor because he was a firearms dealer and he owned a gun store.
So he had the federal license for it.
Yeah. So again, this just goes more to show that the 10-degree angle on the thing. So now if we're working from a 10-degree angle and we look at the margin of error, and again, just 2 degrees off and we're back at 8 degrees. So again, it doesn't eliminate the possibility of this, being fired from this angle and again, falling over and potentially hitting the victim, and this alleged victim.
It certainly doesn't prove what they want it to prove.
Right, exactly. And and also the FBI, what they did do was they did send the gun to the FBI, and the FBI conducted what we call drop or impact testing on the gun to see if it would discharge. And you do that by taking you probably know this. You take a cartridge, you pull it so the bullet comes out. You take the powder out. You just have a primer, and you can do different things. But what they did was, I think they did maybe 1 or 2 tests to see, and they got no results. So they said, okay, so it won't discharge accidentally. But as you know, the more data points you take, the more possible that, the more confident you'll be in your results. So they should have conducted more than just one or 2 tests,
Absolutely.
To raise that confidence level. So again, potentially it could have, discharged. And part of the thing that day was that it was very windy that day. And if you look where that broom is kind of standing, that was the post where he said he put the gun, and you could kind of see the top of that red stuff there is the top of the flats, the cans, where he claims it could have fallen over. But again, it was very windy that day. And you see the position of the broom there. If you look, the position of the broom is actually changed because of the wind. And it was actually so windy that day that they had to put tarp on the body and weigh it down with rocks to keep it from blowing away. So again, we're able to show that this reconstruction, wasn't necessarily accurate, and actually given the margin of errors that the scenario could have been either way.
Well, and at that point, the reconstruction really is meaningless and should never have. I mean, that's a prime scenario for a Daubert challenge.
Right.
That should never come in because of the validity of it.
Right.
Or the lack thereof in this case.
Yeah. I think this would probably be a good stopping point, because I think the rest of them are kind of lengthy, and we're right at about 3 hours, I think.
Well, I've sure enjoyed this, George. I hope our audience has enjoyed it and learned a lot. And I really appreciate you coming and sharing your time and your knowledge. How has everything been with COVID? You guys are still up and running?
Right. Yeah, we're an essential business, at least as far as Mississippi's concerned, because we do provide support for law enforcement, and we have a very small staff here. So we're not like a large lab where we have to work people in shifts and that sort of thing. So it's working out okay for us.
Are you finding that you can? I know that when I first started this series of Credits Without Contacts, I was asking people that if they enjoyed this, that they should send me toilet paper, because
that's
none
the
of us
coin
are
of the realm now.
Yes, it's the new currency.
Right.
But we have been able to get toilet paper now, so I'm not begging for toilet paper from our audience anymore. But are you finding things are difficult to get still, or?
Yeah, I mean, it's like if you time it right at the stores, you can, you know, you get what you need. But you know, it's got to be right when the things. And I find now, finally, at least the stores are limiting the amounts people can buy now, which they should have done from the very beginning. But
Right. I've noticed that too. And it's kind of a lottery. We've been doing the online shopping and then going to pick it up.
mhm.
And it's a lottery of what you get from what you ordered.
Oh, okay.
And we're getting usually about a quarter of what we order we actually receive.
Wow.
But it's just now starting to hit the Phoenix area fairly hard.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. I was just I just passed my 2-week thing because I'd flown to Las Vegas to actually go oversee some testing at a lab.
yeah, you had said that right when we first started talking about this. You had
Right.
just
Yeah.
been to Vegas.
Yeah. So I'm just past that. So, you know, I had to fly and everything. So it was, you know, I was a little concerned, but not too bad. So
Well, I don't think I'm going to be up for flying anytime soon. I would rather drive.
yeah. Yeah.
You know, but hopefully we'll get back to where it was soon, and hopefully we're not going to see more deaths out of it.
Yeah. I hope not.
But I know that everybody's trying to come together and do anything that they can, and this is part of it. You know what
Yeah.
we're trying to do with NACDL and people like you who are volunteering their time to try to get information that we will be going. We may not be having court right now, but we all still have cases that
Right.
and this is so very important to get the education out to the lawyers. So
Well, I think this is a great idea. I mean, it's you know, and I like the exchange, you know, back and forth, and the sharing of the ideas. It's like a podcast almost. You know, it's kinda,
yeah, and I would, if I had time, I'd love to do it beyond COVID. But right now, I'm just trying to get through COVID and trying to get the education out there. And I'm super appreciative of our audience.
Yeah.
And of NACDL, and certainly George, you've been wonderful, and the time and effort, I really can't thank you enough, and I also can't thank the audience enough. So I appreciate you all, and stay safe, keep washing your hands, and tune in next time for Credits Without Contact. Thank you,
Thank you.
George.
Thank you, Laura. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Take care. Me too.
You too. Bye bye.
Bye-bye.